Section 1. The Beginning. A young man from Kent, Connecticut. There is a small town in western Connecticut called Kent. It sits in the foothills of the Berkshires, surrounded by farmland and stone walls and forests that go amber and blood red every October. It's the kind of place where people know each other's names, where the pace of life is slow and quiet, and where, on any given evening, you could stand outside and hear almost nothing except wind moving through the trees. Not exactly the kind of place you'd expect to produce one of the most watched, most argued about, most beloved, and most divisive animated television shows in history. But that's where Seth Woodbury MacFarlane was born on the 26th of October, 1973. He grew up in that small New England town, and from almost the very beginning, there was something different about the way he engaged with the world around him. He wasn't interested in sports the way other kids were. He wasn't chasing after the usual things. What Seth MacFarlane was interested in, almost from the moment he could hold a pencil, was drawing. He was fascinated by cartoon characters. He started sketching Woody Woodpecker and Fred Flintstone when he was 2 years old. 2 years old. Before most children are stringing full sentences together, this kid was trying to recreate animated characters on paper with whatever he could find to draw with. As he grew up, that obsession with animation only deepened and got more serious. He wasn't just a fan of cartoons, he wanted to understand how they worked. He wanted to know what made them funny, what made a character feel real, what gave a joke the perfect timing to land. By his teenage years, he was already producing his own short animated pieces, working in the medium that would eventually define his entire career. When the time came to choose a college, the choice was obvious. Seth MacFarlane enrolled at the Rhode Island School of Design, one of the most prestigious art and design institutions in the country, to study film, animation, and video. It was there, at the Rhode Island School of Design, that the seed of what would become Family Guy was actually planted. MacFarlane produced a short animated film for his senior thesis. The film was called The Life of Larry, and it featured a middle-aged, overweight, not particularly bright man named Larry, and his talking dog named Steve. If you were to sit down and watch The Life of Larry right now, the first thing that would happen is your jaw would drop. Because Larry and Steve are unmistakably the earliest versions of Peter and Brian Griffin. The proportions are different, the voices are a little different, the settings are different. But the essence is the same, a lovable, somewhat foolish man. A dog who is smarter than everyone around him, the dynamic between them, the comedic rhythm. It was all there in embryonic form, drawn by a 21-year-old art student who had no idea he was sketching the foundations of a show that would still be running 30 years later. The Life of Larry caught the attention of executives at Hanna-Barbera, the legendary animation studio behind countless Saturday morning cartoons. They offered MacFarlane a job before he had even graduated, which is the kind of thing that sounds like it happens in movies but almost never happens in real life. He accepted, and after leaving Rhode Island, he began working at Hanna-Barbera on shows like Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and Dexter's Laboratory. These were shows that millions of kids were watching in the mid-90s, and MacFarlane was in the writer's room, learning the craft, absorbing how professional animation worked from the inside, and quietly developing his own ideas on the side. In 1997, he produced a follow-up to his thesis short. This one was called Larry and Steve, and it aired on Cartoon Network's What a Cartoon programming block, which was essentially a showcase for up-and-coming animators to present their work. Larry and Steve expanded on what he had done in his student film, pushing the dynamic between the two characters further, sharpening the jokes, getting closer to what his vision actually was. People who watched it were struck by how different it felt from everything else on the block. There was an edge to it, a specific kind of adult humor underneath the cartoon framing, something that didn't quite fit into the usual mold. MacFarlane knew he wanted to bring these characters to network television. He took the characters, redesigned them completely, and built an entire family around them. Larry became Peter, Steve became Brian, and around them, MacFarlane constructed Lois, the patient and capable wife. Meg, the overlooked teenage daughter, Chris, the good-natured and clueless son, and the character who would arguably become the most iconic of all, Stewie Griffin, a 1-year-old baby with a British accent, an evil genius intellect, and an ambition to either conquer the entire world or murder his own mother, whichever came first. In May of 1998, MacFarlane pitched this concept to executives at Fox Broadcasting. He presented a 7-minute pilot that he had produced largely by hand. Fox liked what they saw. They greenlit the show. Seth MacFarlane was 24 years old when he got that call, and he was about to change the landscape of animated television in ways that nobody, including himself, could have fully anticipated. The show that he had created was called Family Guy. It was set in a small, fictional New England town. The Griffins lived on Spooner Street in a neighborhood populated by people who would become as familiar to viewers as the main family itself. And on the 31st of January, 1999, the very first episode of Family Guy aired on Fox. It aired right after Super Bowl 33, which meant that roughly 22 million people were already watching Fox that evening when the show came on. 22 million people. That is not a number you earn by being mediocre. That is not a number you see for a show that nobody cared about. That premiere was one of the biggest nights in the history of animated television, and it launched a show that, as of 2026, has been on the air for more than a quarter of a century. But here's the thing that makes the story of Family Guy so unusual, so compelling, so strange and worth telling in full. Those 22 million viewers? They wouldn't save it. Not at first. The show would be canceled. It would come back. It would be canceled again. It would come back again, even stronger. The creator would walk away from it creatively, even while still voicing the characters. The characters themselves would go through transformations so dramatic that fans would spend decades debating whether they were still watching the same show. And woven through all of it, there are theories and mysteries and pieces of buried lore that change the way you see the entire thing when you hold them up to the light. So settle in. Get comfortable wherever you are right now. Let the weight of the day just go. Because we are going to tell the entire story of Family Guy from the very beginning to where it stands right now, including every theory, every twist, every transformation, every moment of pure genius, and every strange corner of the universe that MacFarlane built, whether he meant to or not. Hey, before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me the time and place you're watching from. I love seeing where you all are in the world, and it really does help the channel more than you know. And if this is your first time here and this kind of slow, story-driven content is your thing, the subscribe button is right there. It's free, and it means everything to this community. Now, let's continue. Section 2. The Golden Years. Seasons 1 through 3 and what made them special. When you strip away everything that Family Guy became over its 20-plus seasons, when you peel back the decades of evolution and controversy and fan debate and character transformation, what you find at the center of it is something genuinely remarkable. The first 3 seasons of this show are, by almost any measure, some of the most well-crafted animated comedy ever made for network television. Not because they were perfect, they weren't, but because they got something fundamentally right about the relationship between characters, humor, and heart that most animated shows never managed to achieve even in their best seasons. The world that MacFarlane had built was deceptively simple. The Griffin family lived in a modest house on Spooner Street, in a town that served as a kind of affectionate exaggeration of small New England communities. The town had a news station, a diner, a church, a high school, a bar called the Drunken Clam, where Peter and his friends gathered after work. It had the kind of geography that felt lived in, like a place that existed before the cameras started rolling. You got the sense that the streets had been walked 1,000 times before you ever arrived. Peter Griffin, as he existed in those first 3 seasons, is one of the most carefully constructed comedy protagonists of his era. He was overweight, perpetually underdressed, not intellectually gifted by any standard, and constitutionally unable to think before he acted. He worked at a toy factory called the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory, drinking with his buddies, watching television, getting into scrapes that invariably made things worse before they got better. On paper, this describes a type of character that television had done 100 times before. The lovable dope, the well-meaning idiot, the husband who causes chaos while the long-suffering wife holds everything together. But what made early Peter special, what separated him from every other version of that archetype, was a quality that the show protected very carefully in those first 3 seasons. Underneath all the stupidity, Peter Griffin genuinely loved his family. Not in a performative way, not in a way that only showed up when the plot required it. It was woven into who he was. He would do dumb, impulsive, occasionally destructive things, and by the end of the episode, he would recognize it, feel it, and try to make it right. He wasn't always successful, he wasn't always eloquent about it, but the impulse was always there. And that impulse, that fundamental decency beneath the foolishness, is what made you actually care about him. Lois Griffin was written in those early seasons as a woman of genuine depth and patience. She had grown up wealthy in the Pewterschmidt family, with all the privilege and expectations that came with that. She'd chosen a different life, a working-class life with Peter, and the show treated that choice as a real thing that defined her character rather than just a plot convenience. She played piano. She was the one who had to hold the household together when Peter's schemes went off the rails. She was smart, capable, and sometimes slyly funny in ways that the character would later lose. The dynamic between Peter and Lois in those early seasons had a warmth and a real texture to it. When they fought, it felt like a fight between two people who actually knew each other deeply. When they made up, it felt earned. Then there was Brian. Oh, Brian. In those first 3 seasons, Brian Griffin was one of the best written supporting characters on television in any genre. The fundamental joke of Brian is that he is the most intelligent and self-aware member of the Griffin family, the one who most resembles a functional adult human being. And he is also literally a dog. He walks on 2 legs. He sips martinis. He drives a car on occasion. He keeps a running mental commentary on the absurdity of his surroundings with a dry wit that never quite tipped into meanness. He was Peter's best friend, and the dynamic between them was perfect. Peter was Case, and Brian was the grounded observer who both participated in and narrated the chaos. Brian also had a private inner life that made him feel genuinely real. He was a frustrated writer who hadn't finished his novel. He carried quietly unrequited feelings for Lois that he kept mostly buried. He drank a little more than he should. He was, beneath the wit and the polish, a little bit lonely. These weren't exaggerated character traits. They were the kind of small, ordinary sadnesses that actual people carry around, rendered just enough above ground to be visible without being the whole show. You felt like you knew him. That is an extraordinary achievement for any character, let alone one who is, technically, a Labrador Retriever. And then there is Stewie. In the first season of Family Guy, Stewie Griffin was, without any qualification or caveat, one of the most original character concepts in the history of American animated television. He was 1 year old. He sat in a high chair at the kitchen table. He wore a yellow shirt and a white diaper. He was, to all outward appearances, a normal toddler, except that he spoke with a refined British accent, constructed elaborate weapons and mechanical devices in his bedroom, and spent most of his available mental energy either planning world domination or trying to figure out how to kill his mother. The comedy worked because of the contrast. The gap between what Stewie looked like, this small, round, completely helpless infant, and what he actually was, a criminal mastermind with genuine malice and a vocabulary drawn from the British ruling class, was a wellspring of humor that the writers returned to constantly, finding new configurations and new angles every time. And crucially, in those first 3 seasons, the threat was real. Stewie was actually dangerous. He built actual weapons. He came genuinely close to harming Lois on multiple occasions. He wasn't defanged or softened for the sake of making him more likable. He was what he was, fully and without apology, and that made him electric to watch. The humor in these early seasons had a texture that's hard to describe but easy to recognize when you're experiencing it. Yes, there were cutaway gags. Yes, there were non sequiturs and absurdist flights, but they were deployed in service of actual stories. Each episode had a real beginning, middle, and end. The Griffins had goals and encountered obstacles, and the comedy emerged from how they navigated those obstacles. The cutaways were like bonus tracks on an album you were already enjoying. They added something without replacing anything. You could theoretically have removed every single cutaway from a season 1 episode and still had a coherent, funny, emotionally satisfying piece of television. The writing staff that MacFarlane assembled for those first 3 seasons deserves recognition. He brought together people including Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Neil Goldman, and Garrett Donovan, among others. These writers shared a sensibility and a commitment to quality that showed in every episode. MacFarlane himself was deeply embedded in the process at every stage, not just as the voice of Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, but as the creative vision at the center of every decision. When you watch those early episodes now, you can feel a specific human intelligence behind them. There is a point of view. There is something this show cares about. Some specific episodes from this era deserve to be remembered with real affection. Death Has a Shadow. The very first episode established the tone immediately. Peter loses his job, files for welfare fraudulently, gets caught, and the episode resolves in a way that is simultaneously absurd and strangely heartfelt. The kiss seen around the world showed Meg navigating her complicated feelings about popularity and being loved. Brian, Portrait of a Dog, in which Brian runs away after Peter treats him unkindly, forcing Peter to confront what their friendship actually means to him, is among the most emotionally resonant episodes the show ever made. I Never Met the Dead Man, in which Peter accidentally destroys the town's television signal and the Griffins have to learn to talk to each other, has a genuine thesis about connection and distraction that feels startlingly relevant right now. In 2026, more than 2 decades after it originally aired. And then, at the height of its initial run, just when things seemed settled and the show had found its voice and its audience, Fox pulled the rug out. The network had a long history of moving shows around the schedule without warning or logic, and Family Guy was no exception. In its second season, Fox shifted it to Thursday nights at 9 in the evening, which put it directly opposite Frasier on NBC. Frasier was one of the most popular comedies on American television at the time. It was not a fair fight, and the ratings suffered accordingly. Fox then moved Family Guy to Tuesday nights, where it ran against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC, another show pulling massive viewership. The shuffling continued with little notice given to the audience, making it genuinely hard for viewers to know when the show was even on. By the end of the third season in 2002, Fox canceled Family Guy. Officially. Completely. The show was done. MacFarlane and his writers packed up their things. The voice cast moved on to other projects. The world had a lot of canceled television shows in it, and Family Guy was now one of them. Nobody expected it to come back. Nothing in the history of American network television had really suggested that a show canceled twice with scattered scheduling and declining ratings was the kind of thing that got a second chance. But something was already building in the background that would change everything. Section 3. Death, Resurrection, and the Show That Refused to Stay. Canceled. The cancellation of Family Guy in 2002 should have been the end. In the normal logic of the television industry, a show that had been canceled once already, shuffled around the schedule without warning, and then canceled. A second time is not a show that comes back. It is a show that becomes a footnote. Something that enthusiasts mention occasionally in conversations about animated television that could have been, like so many other promising series, that didn't get the time and stability they needed to find their full audience. But what happened to Family Guy after its cancellation in 2002 is genuinely one of the most remarkable stories in the history of American television. And it happened because of something that nobody in the television industry had anticipated. The rise of cable reruns and the home video market were about to transform the way people related to shows they had already seen or had never seen at all. Cartoon Network, which operated a late-night programming block called Adult Swim, was looking for content. Adult Swim had launched in 2001 as a block of edgy, adult-oriented animation for people who were still up after midnight. It needed programming, and programming cost money, and money was tight. When Family Guy became available in the secondary rights market, it was available cheaply. Nobody thought it was worth much. It was a canceled Fox show with inconsistent ratings and no obvious future. Cartoon Network acquired the rights to air reruns for essentially nothing. The Family Guy reruns began airing on Adult Swim on the 20th of April, 2003. And what happened next was something that the television industry would be analyzing and trying to replicate for the next decade. Almost overnight, Family Guy became the most watched program in the Adult Swim lineup. Not one of the most watched, not a solid performer, the most watched. It dominated late-night cable viewing to a degree that nobody had seen coming. Adult Swim's overall viewership jumped by 239% in the period after Family Guy started airing. 239%. Those are not modest gains. Those are the kind of numbers that make executives sit up straight and start making phone calls. At the same time, DVD releases of the first and second seasons hit stores, and they sold over 400,000 copies. Again, for a show that had been canceled and was supposedly finished, this was extraordinary. People weren't just watching the reruns. They were buying the show. They were rewatching it. They were lending the discs to their friends and telling them to start from the beginning. A cult following was being built, not through broadcast television, but through repeat viewings and word of mouth, which, as it turned out, was a much more durable kind of fan base than a large premiere audience that then drifted away. Fox, the network that had canceled Family Guy twice, was watching all of this. They saw the Adult Swim ratings, they saw the DVD numbers. They saw the passionate vocal fan community that had emerged around a show they had let go. And in 2004, Fox made the decision to order new episodes. Season 4 was greenlit. Family Guy was coming back. The announcement was met with genuine jubilation from fans who had watched Adult Swim and bought the DVDs and never quite accepted that the show was really gone. This kind of thing simply didn't happen. Shows got canceled. Sometimes beloved shows got canceled unfairly, and fans protested, and maybe there would be a direct-to-video movie or a miniseries to give things a sense of closure, but a full network revival? With new episodes on the original network? That was not something that happened, but it happened to Family Guy, and it would happen twice. The fourth season premiered on the 1st of May 2005, and Fox made sure it was an event. They placed Family Guy at the center of their Sunday night animation domination lineup, a branded block of animated comedies that also included The Simpsons, King of the Hill, and a brand new McFarlane creation called American Dad, which premiered just a few months earlier in February. The hype was real, and the audience showed up. Season 4 pulled in numbers that justified every decision Fox had made to bring the show back. But the 3 years away had changed things. This is the part of the story where the texture begins to shift, where you have to pay attention carefully if you want to understand everything that came after. When a show gets canceled, the writing staff disperses. Writers find new jobs, join other rooms, start different projects. You cannot ask people to hold their professional lives in suspended animation while waiting for a show that might never return. So when Family Guy came back in 2005, it was not the same writing room that had produced the first 3 seasons. Some of the original writers were back, but many were gone, replaced by new people who brought different sensibilities and different instincts to the table. McFarlane himself acknowledged this directly in interviews. One of the lasting effects of Family Guy's rocky early history, canceled once, then again, then revived, was that the show was always having to restaff its writing room. Institutional memory, the collective understanding of what a show is and what it values and where its limits are, that's something that takes time to build and can be scattered in an afternoon when everyone is told to go home. The animation also changed, in ways that were subtle but noticeable to anyone paying close attention. The early seasons had a rougher, more handmade quality to them. The characters moved in a way that felt loose and expressive. When something physically absurd happened, there was an energy to the way it was drawn that made it funnier. The revival seasons were cleaner, more polished in a technical sense, but also a little stiffer. The outlines were heavier. The movement was more constrained. The show looked better in certain ways and felt a little less alive in others. And the cutaway gags, which had been a feature of the show from the very beginning, began to expand their footprint. In the first 3 seasons, a cutaway was a bonus, a spice added to something that was already working. Starting in season 4, cutaways began to take on more structural weight. They started to become longer, more frequent, and more central to how an episode generated its humor. This was not catastrophic in season 4. The balance was still mostly there, but a trend was beginning that, in the years ahead, would accelerate significantly. However, and this is important, seasons 4 and 5 still had enough of the original show's spirit to produce some genuinely extraordinary television. The season 6 two-parter Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie represented one of the most ambitious things the show had ever attempted. A direct engagement with the fundamental premise of Stewie's character, finally played out at full dramatic scale. There were road to episodes, Road to Rupert, Road to Germany. that showed Brian and Stewie at their best, an odd couple dynamic that worked, because both characters were still fully realized at this point. There were moments of real emotional resonance, of clever satirical writing, of comedy that earned its laughs rather than just demanding them. The show that came back in 2005 was not the show that left in 2002, but it was still, in most of the ways that mattered, Family Guy. What came next would begin to test that more severely. Section 4. Peter Griffin. The complete story of a man who used to be lovable. There is a concept in the world of long-running television called Flanderization. The word comes from a character on The Simpsons, Ned Flanders, the devout neighbor of Homer Simpson, who in the early seasons was a warm, multi-dimensional person who happened to be religious, and who over the course of 20-plus seasons was gradually reduced until his entire identity was just that single trait, his religious fervor. Everything else that made Ned Flanders a complete human being was slowly sanded away, and what was left was a single note played on infinite repeat. Family Guy may be the single clearest example of Flanderization ever seen in an animated series, and the character who suffered it most severely is Peter Griffin himself. To understand the full tragedy of what happened to Peter, you have to really hold in your mind what he was at the beginning. Not just intellectually know it, but actually feel the difference. In the first season of Family Guy, Peter Griffin was a working-class father from a small New England town. He worked at a toy factory. He watched a lot of television. He had strong feelings about movies and beer and his friends at the bar. He made impulsive decisions that he didn't think through, and those decisions had consequences, and he felt those consequences, and he tried to make things right. Here is the key phrase: he tried to make things right. That impulse, that awareness that he had caused a problem, and the subsequent desire to fix it, is what separated early Peter from almost every version of the character that came after. He was dumb, yes. He was thoughtless, certainly. But underneath the stupidity, there was a genuinely decent man who loved his family and was capable of feeling bad when he hurt them. Let's talk about specific episodes. In the first season, A Hero Sits Next Door introduces Joe Swanson as the new neighbor, a police officer in a wheelchair who is immediately popular with everyone in the neighborhood. Peter becomes jealous. He schemes. He makes things worse. And then, at the end, he recognizes that his jealousy was petty, that Joe is genuinely admirable, and he lets it go. That is a character arc. Small, contained within a single episode, but real. Character arcs require that the character actually feels something and changes accordingly. Early Peter felt things. I Never Met the Dead Man shows Peter accidentally destroying the town's television antenna. The Griffins have to spend time together without screens. Peter initially resists, but by the end, he has genuinely engaged with his family in a way that felt like growth, even temporary growth. Brian, Portrait of a Dog, ends with Peter realizing he had been treating Brian more like property than like a friend, and doing something about it. These small moments of recognition and repair are what made the early seasons feel human. They gave the show warmth. They made you care about these people even when they were being foolish, because you could see that they cared about each other underneath all the foolishness. Now hold that image. Hold it carefully. Because what happened to Peter Griffin over the following 15 seasons is one of the more disquieting examples of a creative erosion that anyone who watched the show closely can track almost episode by episode. The first changes were subtle. Around season 4, Peter's stupidity began to shade into something slightly different. He was still bumbling, but the things he bumbled his way into were a little meaner. The consequences for the people around him were a little more severe. And the moment at the end of the episode where he recognized what he'd done and tried to fix it became less consistent. Sometimes it was still there. Sometimes the episode ended with Peter having caused significant damage to someone he was supposed to love, and the show just moving on, not holding him accountable in any emotional sense. By season 8, the transformation was dramatic. The Peter Griffin who existed from this point forward was a fundamentally different character wearing the same face. His stupidity had become less of a personality quirk and more of a complete replacement for any other personality trait. He didn't just make bad decisions because he didn't think things through. He seemed incapable of basic human reasoning of almost any kind. He had become something closer to a force of nature than a person. A large, blunt object moving through the world, leaving destruction in his wake, with apparently no internal experience of the damage he was causing. The show's own writers, in the season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party, put a devastating indictment of this transformation into Meg's mouth. In that episode, Meg Griffin finally snaps. Years of accumulated abuse, years of being the family's punching bag, years of insults and dismissal and cruelty, and she confronts her father directly. She calls him completely selfish. She says he has no interests, no education, that he just does whatever reckless thing he feels like doing without a thought for how it affects anyone else. She tells him he has terrorized the community with his impulsive behavior. She describes specific acts of cruelty and neglect, and she says explicitly that if someone in the outside world could see how he treats her, he would be in prison. Every single thing Meg says in that speech is accurate. It is not hyperbole. It is not a dramatic exaggeration. It is a factual description of things the show has depicted him doing. And the show knows this because the writers wrote it. They put it in Meg's mouth and they let it sit there, uncontested and true. And Peter laughs. That's his response. Not guilt, not shame, not even blank incomprehension. He laughs. That laugh says everything about how far the character had traveled from who he was in the pilot episode. Early Peter would have been hurt by those words, even if he didn't fully understand them. He would have felt something. The Peter of season 10 didn't feel anything, or if he did, the show no longer thought it was worth depicting. Some specific examples from the later seasons tell this story more vividly than any summary can. In one episode, Peter and Lois are on a boat, and he sees what he thinks is a shark approaching through the water. His immediate response is to shove Lois underwater and flee in the boat, leaving his wife to what he believes is a shark attack so that he can escape. It turns out to be a dolphin, but that doesn't change what he did. He tried to sacrifice his wife to save himself. That scene is presented as comedy. In another episode, it is revealed through a flashback that Peter and Lois once tried to abandon Meg at a fire station when she was an infant, when she was a baby who could not yet walk or speak or form any kind of impression on them. They tried to leave her there. And this is a joke. The audience is supposed to laugh. There is an episode in which Peter steals Halloween candy from Stewie, a grown man stealing candy from his own baby. And it's mentioned that he used to do this to Chris as well when Chris was little, just to make sure the pattern of behavior is established. In an episode centered on Joe's marriage, Peter convinces Joe to be unfaithful to his wife Bonnie. Joe is supposed to be one of Peter's closest friends, a person Peter cares about. Early Peter might have accidentally given terrible advice out of genuine stupidity, but would not have deliberately worked to destabilize his friend's marriage. What's especially painful about tracking this transformation is that the show occasionally tried to walk it back. There are episodes scattered through the later seasons where Peter does something genuinely kind, where the warmth from the early years resurfaces, where you see a glimpse of who he was supposed to be. In Peter's Sister, the show attempts to explain Peter's abusive behavior toward Meg by revealing that Peter himself was bullied and abused by his own sister growing up, and that this cycle of abuse has shaped how he relates to Meg. Peter and Meg have a moment of genuine reconciliation. It's a well-written episode, emotionally grounded and thoughtful. And then the very next episode, everything resets. Peter is back to treating Meg terribly. The reconciliation never happened. The insight gained in Peter's Sister has vanished from the show's memory as thoroughly as if it had never occurred. This is perhaps the defining structural failure of the later seasons. The show could generate meaningful moments, but it refused to let them mean anything. The reset button was pressed after every episode that got close to real character development, erasing whatever progress had been made and returning everyone to their default state. Peter's relationships with his friends, with Joe and Quagmire in Cleveland, underwent a similar erosion. The group dynamic at the Drunken Clam changed from four guys who genuinely liked each other and occasionally drove each other crazy into something much more transactional and sometimes outright cruel. The warmth between them thinned out. Peter would do genuinely awful things to each of them, deliberately, with apparent intent to cause harm. and the show would treat it as just another episode in their ongoing lives. The Peter Griffin of the later seasons is not the Peter Griffin who was funny. He is the Peter Griffin who is unpleasant, and that distinction matters enormously because the entire show was built on his foundation. When the foundation becomes something you want to get away from rather than something you want to spend time with, everything above it is compromised. Section 5. Brian Griffin. The saddest character arc in animated television. If Peter Griffin's decline was a gradual coarsening, a slow replacement of warmth with cruelty, Brian Griffin's decline was something more specific and in some ways more heartbreaking. It was the collapse of a character who had been, in the truest sense, the moral center of the show. The character who grounded everything. The one the audience was supposed to identify with. The one who felt most like a real person. Brian's origin as a character is inseparable from the show's premise. The joke was simple but brilliant. The most adult, most reasonable, most intellectually engaged member of the Griffin household was the family dog. He walked upright. He drank gin martinis at the kitchen counter. He drove when necessary. He had opinions about literature and politics and music. He was unlucky in love and quietly aware of his own underachievement. He was, in every meaningful sense except the physical one, a person. In the first 3 seasons, Brian served a function that was unique in the show and nearly unique in animated television generally. He was the audience's proxy. When Peter did something absurd or destructive, Brian's reaction was the reaction you and I would have. When the family descended into some new chaos, Brian was the one who stood slightly outside it, observing with dry bemusement, occasionally getting pulled in but always retaining a perspective that the other characters lacked. He was the one who knew things were weird. His awareness of the weirdness was the show's acknowledgement that, yes, we know this is strange, we're all in on it together. He also had a failed novel. This detail is more important than it might initially seem. The failed novel wasn't just a joke about Brian's pretensions. It was a genuine characterization. Here is a being of intelligence and sensitivity who has not managed to translate those qualities into the achievement he wants most. He wants to be a writer. He can't finish the book. He drinks to manage the gap between who he is and who he wants to be. That is a profoundly human kind of suffering, rendered in the body of a Labrador retriever, and it made Brian feel achingly real in a way that none of the other characters quite managed. His quietly held feelings for Lois were another piece of this texture. He loved her, he was careful about it, kept it mostly to himself, but it surfaced occasionally in ways that were genuinely touching rather than weird or inappropriate. It was unrequited, and he knew it was unrequited, and he carried it anyway, the way people carry feelings that they know are impossible. That, too, was deeply human. Then the revival happened, and the slow transformation began. In seasons 4 and 5, Brian's political views started to take on more of the conversation. He had always had opinions, liberal, atheist, skeptical of authority, but in the early seasons, those views were just one ingredient in a complex recipe. After the revival, they became more dominant. Scenes were written specifically to allow Brian to deliver political monologues. Episodes were structured around his ideology rather than his personality. The character who had been multidimensional was being compressed, his many qualities slowly subordinated to a single ideological function. Even for viewers who agreed with Brian's politics, and many did, this was grating. Because it didn't feel like Brian talking. It felt like the writers talking through Brian. The distinction between a character who has political views and a character who exists to express political views is enormous, and the show progressively lost track of it. But the ideology was just the beginning. What happened to Brian's actual character underneath the politics was more serious and harder to watch. The Brian of the early seasons was genuinely intelligent. He had read the books he referenced. He had real insight. He had moral integrity that was imperfect but real. The Brian of the later seasons was a fraud. He talked constantly about being a writer and an intellectual and a moral person, but none of it held up. His novel, when it was finally referenced in later seasons, was revealed to be terrible. His morality, when tested, was repeatedly found to be a performance rather than a genuine value system. The gap between who Brian claimed to be and who he actually was became wider with every season, until it was a chasm. The episode that many people point to as the moment Brian became genuinely unlikable rather than just imperfect is Brian Writes a Bestseller from season 9. In this episode, Stewie encourages Brian to return to writing after a long period of not producing anything. Brian responds by writing a self-help book, a genre he would have previously dismissed as beneath him, called Wish It, Want It, Do It. The book becomes a massive bestseller. Brian becomes famous, and then he turns on Stewie. The person who believed in him when he had nothing, the only one who pushed him to create something, the friend who handed him the opportunity, Brian treats Stewie with contempt. He becomes so arrogant, so inflated by sudden success, so blinded by his own reflection in the mirror, that he can't see what he's doing to the relationship that mattered most in his life. This episode is painful to watch not because Brian's behavior is surprising, but because it fits so perfectly into a pattern. The later seasons are full of examples of Brian doing terrible things to people he was supposed to care about. He gave both Chris and Stewie herpes through recklessness, and then acted as though this was barely worth addressing. He destroyed Stewie's beloved teddy bear Rupert in a moment of drunken pique. In one episode, he finds a woman trapped in a car that is about to fall into the ocean and begins to rescue her. But when he discovers she has a child, meaning she is presumably in a relationship, he lets go and allows her and the child to drown, because she isn't available for him to date. He lets an innocent woman and her infant child die because she can't be his girlfriend. That is not a dark joke. That is something that is presented as a joke but describes a character who has become, in any meaningful moral sense, a villain. The relationship between Brian and Quagmire became one of the most talked about dynamics in the show's later seasons for this reason. Quagmire, who is not exactly a paragon of virtue himself, delivered a speech in the season 8 episode Jerome is the New Black that laid out with devastating precision exactly what Brian had become. He called Brian a phony. He called out the constant hitting on Lois, the sycophantic relationship with Peter, the failures as a father, the pretentious literary persona built on actual intellectual emptiness. Everything Quagmire said was supported by the show's own established facts. It wasn't unfair. It was, as far as these things can be assessed, the truth. And the show clearly knew it. The writers wrote the speech. They intended the audience to agree with Quagmire. They were acknowledging that Brian had become insufferable. But then they did something that made the acknowledgement worse rather than better. They used the speech as a pressure release valve and then went right back to making Brian more awful. The speech changed nothing. It was a way of saying, yes, we know, we see it too, while simultaneously continuing to do the thing they were being called out for. Then came November 24th, 2013. Season 12, the episode Life of Brian. And here's where the story gets genuinely strange. In Life of Brian, Brian Griffin is hit by a car and killed. Not in a comedic way, not in a cutaway. He is struck by a car on the street, and the show treats his death as a real, serious, devastating event. The Griffin family mourns him. Stewie is inconsolable. A new dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico of Sopranos fame, is adopted by the family, and the show appears to be moving forward with a genuinely different status quo. Fans were stunned. The death of Brian Griffin trended on social media for days. It made national headlines. There were think pieces and eulogies and fan campaigns demanding his return. The outpouring was genuine. Even though Brian had become increasingly difficult to like in recent seasons, people's connection to who he had been, to the early Brian, the one who felt real, was deep enough to produce real grief at his apparent passing. 2 episodes later, in the Christmas episode Christmas Guy, Stewie uses a time travel device to go back and prevent Brian from being hit by the car. Brian is restored to life. Everything returns to exactly the way it was. The fan reaction to Brian's revival was not the gratitude and relief that the writers might have hoped for. It was, for a significant portion of the audience, fury. The death had been used as a ratings grab, a fake emotional event designed to generate attention and viewership, and the revival confirmed it. Nothing had meant anything. The story had no weight, the grief had been manufactured and then discarded. The show had treated its audience as an audience to be manipulated rather than a community to be respected. After his return, Brian's behavior continued on the same downward trajectory it had been following before his death. If anything, the experience seemed to accelerate his worst qualities rather than moderate them. He was still pretentious. He was still selfish. He was still a fraud who claimed to occupy a moral high ground that his actual conduct consistently undermined. But here's the strange and almost unbearably sad part of Brian's story. There are episodes scattered through even the worst stretches of the later seasons where you can still see who he was supposed to be. Episodes where he shows genuine warmth, genuine loyalty, genuine care for Stewie. Episodes where the writing reaches back to the original character and finds him still there, underneath everything. Those moments prove that the writers knew what they had. They remembered Brian. They just couldn't commit to him consistently. Section 6. Stewie Griffin. The evil genius who became something else. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If you had to name the single most original character concept in American animated television, what would you say? Superman's adopted alien son? A post-apocalyptic boy adventurer and his magical dog? A talking SpongeBob in an underwater fast food restaurant? All interesting choices, all original in their ways. But there's an argument to be made, a strong one, that the most purely original character concept produced by American animation in the past 30 years is Stewie Griffin. 1-year-old, barely walking, communicating in an accent drawn from mid-century British aristocracy, designing and constructing weapons, vehicles, time machines, and mind control devices in his bedroom between naps. And his central, defining goal? Killing his mother. The concept shouldn't work. It sounds absurd when you describe it in dry terms. A murderous baby, an evil genius in a diaper. But in practice, in execution, in the hands of Seth MacFarlane and the writing staff of the early seasons, it was something close to perfect comedy. And the show took it away. In the first season, Stewie was presented without apology or mitigation as exactly what he was. A brilliant, cold, calculating infant who had decided that world domination was his purpose and that his mother was his primary obstacle. The comedy was multi-layered. There was the basic visual comedy of a baby speaking like a Bond villain. There was the dramatic irony of Lois having no idea what was in the mind of the child she was hugging and feeding and loving. There was the absurdist comedy of the contrast between Stewie's grand ambitions and the physical reality of his situation. This planet-conquering mastermind still needed someone to change his diaper. And there was something underneath all of it that was genuinely unsettling. Stewie was actually dangerous. His plans were real. His weapons worked. His intelligence was extraordinary. When he looked at Lois, there was something in his eyes that was not the look of a baby looking at his mother. It was the look of an adversary sizing up an obstacle. That charge of genuine menace was what made every scene with him electrically funny. You were laughing at something that was simultaneously genuinely alarming, and that tension was the comedy's engine. Brian was one of the few characters who could understand Stewie. In those first seasons, most of the other characters seemed to hear only babbling when Stewie spoke. His elaborate speeches and villainous monologues registered to the adults around him as infant vocalizations. Brian heard him clearly, could respond, could engage. This created the foundation for the Brian and Stewie relationship that would later become the most beloved aspect of the show. But in the early seasons, the relationship was colored by what Stewie actually was. Brian wasn't charmed by Stewie the way later seasons would portray things. He was wary of him. He recognized the intelligence and was appropriately cautious. The first hints of the softening that would eventually transform the character completely appeared in Season 2, introduced lightly and almost experimentally. There were small moments, brief flashes of vulnerability, glimpses of a different side, quick jokes about Stewie's femininity, or his uncertainty about himself that punctuated his evil genius persona without displacing it. These were seeds planted carefully that would take several seasons to fully flower. By Season 3, the softening was more noticeable. Stewie was still evil. He still plotted against Lois. He still built weapons and spoke about world domination with genuine conviction. But the emotional undercurrent of his character was more present, more audible. His relationship with Brian was warmer. His vulnerability was more visible. The writers were clearly testing something. How much of the evil genius could you shade in without losing what made him special? The answer they arrived at after the show returned from its first cancellation in 2005 was all of it. And that decision is one of the most consequential creative choices in the show's entire run. Seth MacFarlane and the writers have been open about their reasoning. They felt that the evil baby concept had been exhausted. They felt they had taken it as far as it could go. The jokes about Stewie trying to kill Lois had been done in every configuration they could think of, and they were worried that continuing to repeat them would make the character feel stale. So, they decided to evolve him, to take him somewhere new, to let him grow. From season 4 onward, Stewie's world domination plots became progressively rarer and then essentially ceased. His attempts to harm Lois faded to almost nothing. The weapons and the machines and the schemes that had been his defining characteristics were quietly retired. In their place came a Stewie who was emotional, insecure, searching for his identity, building a deep friendship with Brian, going on adventures, and showing a level of warmth and vulnerability that the original character had been specifically designed not to have. The Brian and Stewie Road to episodes, Road to Rhode Island, Road to Europe, Road to Rupert, and eventually Road to the Multiverse, became some of the most beloved episodes in the entire series. These were special adventure episodes where the two of them would be transported out of their usual setting and forced to navigate some new and strange context together, their contrasting personalities playing off each other in ways that were consistently funny and often surprisingly touching. The chemistry between them in these episodes was real. It worked. The newer, softer Stewie was capable of things that the original evil genius Stewie wasn't. Genuine emotional connection, sacrifice, love. The season 6 two-parter, Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie, functions almost as a farewell to the original concept. In these episodes, Stewie finally achieves what he had been trying to do since the pilot. He kills Lois. He takes over the world. He becomes the dictator he always said he would be. It is played at full dramatic scale, thrilling and darkly funny and genuinely exciting. And then the twist, it was a simulation on Stewie's computer. None of it actually happened. The world is reset. Many fans read this as the show's acknowledgement that the old Stewie was over. Here is the evil genius, given his ultimate moment, given everything he ever wanted. And then the show takes it back, frames it as a fantasy, and closes the door. After those episodes, the original Stewie essentially never returned in any serious way. The new Stewie, the emotional and identity-searching one, was given increasing amounts of storyline focused on his apparent sexuality and gender expression. From season 4 onward, this became one of the dominant aspects of his characterization. Cross-dressing, references to attraction toward men, experiments with femininity. These became so frequent that for many viewers, Stewie's identity as a character shifted from being defined by his evil genius to being defined almost entirely by these other qualities. Whether you see this as genuine character development or as a replacement of something irreplaceable depends on what you valued about the original Stewie. If you fell in love with his warmth and his friendship with Brian and his emotional depth, things that the new Stewie has in abundance, then the evolution might feel like growth. If what you fell in love with was the specific, unrepeatable quality of an evil genius baby, the thing that made Family Guy unlike anything else on television, then the evolution feels like a loss that was never adequately acknowledged. The argument that the evil baby concept was exhausted, while understandable as a creative concern, doesn't fully hold up when you consider the timeline. Family Guy has now produced far more seasons with the softened version of Stewie than it ever did with the original. If the writers could sustain the newer version for 15-plus seasons, there's no obvious reason the original concept couldn't have been extended and developed further. The evil genius concept wasn't a single joke. It was a premise with infinite possibilities. New inventions, new schemes, new rivals, new dimensions of his relationship with the world around him that were never explored. They chose not to explore them. What's coming next is particularly relevant to Stewie's story. Fox has announced and confirmed for the 2027 to 2028 season a new spin-off series simply called Stewie. Seth MacFarlane himself will return to voice the character. The series follows Stewie after he is kicked out of preschool and forced to enroll in a new, considerably less prestigious institution, where he proceeds to use his array of time and space travel devices to take his miserable new classmates on adventures. The show has been given a two-season order and will stream on Hulu the day after broadcast and on Disney Plus internationally. The premise is interesting because it gestures toward the qualities that made the original Stewie special. The sci-fi inventions, the misanthropy, the sense of a genius trapped in an inappropriate context, while also leaving space for the evolved, emotionally complex version that the later seasons developed. Whether MacFarlane and showrunner Kirker Butler managed to strike a balance that satisfies the fans who loved both versions remains, as of now, an open and genuinely exciting question. Section 7. Meg, Chris, and Lois. The overlooked Griffins and their complicated journeys. The Griffins were a family. That seems like an obvious thing to say, but it matters. Because a family is not just a collection of individuals. A family is a system. Each member's story is entangled with every other member's story. You cannot understand Meg without understanding Peter. You cannot understand Chris without understanding the household that shaped him. You cannot understand what happened to Lois without understanding what happened to the show's idea of what women were for. Let's start with Meg, because Meg's story may be the most instructive single thread in the show's entire history. In the first season, Meg Griffin was voiced by Lacey Chabert, who would later be replaced starting from season 2 by Mila Kunis, who has remained the voice of the character ever since. In those earliest episodes, Meg was exactly what she appeared to be, the oldest Griffin child, a teenager navigating the ordinary miseries of high school unpopularity, the specific alienation of being the least interesting person in a family full of extraordinary people. She wanted friends, wanted to be seen, wanted to belong somewhere. These are among the most universal experiences in human adolescence, and Meg embodied them without exaggeration. She was not a figure of fun. She was a figure of quiet, recognizable pathos. The jokes about Meg in those first 3 seasons were gentle. She was overlooked, ignored, treated as the afterthought in a family where everyone else was always more interesting. That was the comedy. Not that Meg deserved to be ignored, but that she often was. And the contrast between her genuine desire to connect and the family's inability to see her was the source of gentle, sympathetic humor. Then something shifted, and the shift was neither gentle nor sympathetic. Starting around season 4 and escalating through seasons 5, 6, and 7, the jokes about Meg moved from her being overlooked to her being actively despised. Her appearance became a target. Her desirability became a punchline. Characters began reacting to her presence with physical revulsion, gagging, fleeing, expressing that her company was not merely uninteresting, but actively offensive. The transition was not announced or explained. It just happened, one episode at a time, with each step extending slightly further than the last. By seasons 8 through 14, the abuse of Meg Griffin had become one of the defining features of the show. Not a feature, as in a good thing, a feature as in a structural element. It was everywhere. Peter farted in her face as entertainment. Peter insulted her constantly, her appearance and her value as a person. The show included flashbacks revealing that Peter and Lois had attempted to abandon Meg at a fire station when she was an infant, to abandon their newborn daughter like an unwanted pet, and this was played as a joke. A joke! It was revealed that Peter had tried to give Meg away on other occasions. He forgot she existed. He wished she would go away. And it wasn't just Peter. Lois, who had been a warm and patient mother in the early seasons, became distant and cold toward Meg. Chris joined in on the abuse. Even Stewie, who had almost no early relationship with Meg, started treating her with casual cruelty when their paths crossed. The entire household, and eventually the entire town, seemed to have collectively agreed that Meg Griffin was worthless, ugly, unwanted, and an acceptable target for whatever negative feeling needed somewhere to land. The real-world impact of this was documented by the very woman who gave Meg her voice. Mila Kunis spoke publicly about how the catchphrase that became associated with Peter's dismissal of Meg, a specific phrase that became meme famous, would be directed at her, the actual human actress, by people she encountered in real life. The fictional cruelty had seeped through the screen into reality and attached itself to the person doing the voice work, which is a genuinely disturbing outcome. The season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party is the event around which all discussion of Meg's treatment eventually converges. In this episode, Meg finally confronts her family. She delivers a speech that is honest and raw and devastating, laying out everything they have done to her and what it has cost her. It is, for a long and cathartic moment, genuinely satisfying. This character who has been punished for years, finally getting the chance to speak the truth clearly and have people hear it. And then the episode ends with Meg walking it all back. She agrees to accept her role as the family's punching bag. The episode frames this as a sacrifice she makes for the family's stability, because without Meg absorbing all their displaced frustration, the family members turn on each other. Without a common target, they destroy themselves. The message is not hard to read, and it is troubling to confront. Some people exist to absorb the pain of others, and they should accept this role because the alternative is chaos. A teenage girl should allow herself to be abused because her family needs someone to abuse. The episode doesn't intend to send this message, most likely, but it sends it anyway, clearly and without ambiguity. The situation began to genuinely improve around seasons 14 and 15, partly credited to the addition of more women to the writing staff who pushed back against the pattern of Meg abuse. She started getting episodes where she was competent, capable, tough. She began fighting back. She was allowed to be good at things. The abuse dropped dramatically in frequency and intensity. By the later seasons, Meg is a genuinely different character than she was between seasons 4 and 14. More dimensional, more respected by the narrative itself, more like the person she might have been if the show had developed her with the same care it applied to Peter and Brian in the golden years. But for roughly 10 seasons, she existed almost entirely as a vehicle for suffering. And that is a wound in the show's history that no amount of later improvement fully erases. Chris Griffin occupies a genuinely strange position in the show's history. He was never the focus of the same dramatic transformation as the other major characters. He remained, through most of the show's run, a reasonably consistent version of what he was in the pilot. A good-natured, somewhat clueless teenage boy with more creative sensitivity than he was given credit for, and an enthusiasm for art and drawing that made him occasionally the most earnest person in the room. There were good Chris episodes scattered throughout the run, episodes that explored his relationships, his self-image, his humor, but he never got the sustained, focused attention that Peter and Brian and Stewie received. Lois Griffin's story is sadder and stranger. In the early seasons, Lois was the show's anchor. She was the most functional adult in the household, the one with the clearest understanding of what was actually happening, the one who carried the weight of keeping everything from flying apart. She was warm without being sentimental, capable without being perfect, and the relationship between her and Peter had enough real texture to feel like a genuine marriage rather than a comedy prop. Over time, Lois changed in ways that were less spectacular than Peter's transformation, but ultimately just as damaging. She became less patient, less warm, more capable of cruelty toward her own children, particularly Meg, more prone to vanity and selfishness. The anchor of the family loosened, and as it loosened, the family's internal gravity collapsed. A family where both parents are capable of genuine cruelty to their own children is not a family that the audience can root for. It's just a collection of damaged people causing more damage. Section 8. The Cutaway Universe. What if they're all real? Here is where the story gets genuinely interesting in a way that goes beyond simple character analysis and into the kind of territory that keeps people up at night thinking about it. Here is where we talk about the theories. Family Guy's cutaway gags are, on their surface, just a storytelling device. A character says, "This reminds me of the time I..." and the screen cuts to a completely different scene, plays out a quick joke, and then returns to the main story. Simple, efficient, enormously popular, as it turns out, in the age of video sharing and short-form content. Some of the most watched Family Guy clips on the internet are standalone cutaways, removed from their episode context entirely, operating as independent comedy sketches. But here's the question that a certain kind of viewer starts asking after watching enough Family Guy. What if the cutaways are real? What if, within the logic of the show's universe, these aren't stylistic interruptions, but actual memories? Actual events that happened to these characters in the past? This theory sounds simple, but its implications are vast. If every cutaway represents a genuine event in the life of the Griffin family, then Peter Griffin has done an almost incomprehensibly enormous number of things. He has met dozens of historical figures. He has been involved in significant world events. He has held every conceivable job, visited every conceivable location, had experiences that would fill several lifetimes. The Cutaway universe, if real, is a much richer and stranger history than any summary of the show's main plots would suggest. There is actually textual support for this idea. In the Season 10 episode Back to the Pilot, Brian and Stewie use Stewie's time machine to travel back to the pilot episode of Family Guy, the literal first episode of the show. When they are there, they observe the characters from that episode standing around during what was originally a cutaway gag, waiting in silence for the action to resume. The joke is that the characters have to physically stand there, doing nothing, while the cutaway plays elsewhere. Their world pauses so that a different world can be shown. This is a fascinating implication. It means, within the show's own internal logic, that cutaways are events happening in adjacent realities that are briefly made visible to the audience. The characters aren't narrating things that didn't really happen. They are referencing windows into experiences that occurred in parallel timelines, in the same universe, but not in the current moment of the episode. If you take this seriously, and the show gave you the tools to, then the Family Guy multiverse is not just the explicit multiverse of Road to the Multiverse. It includes every cutaway ever shown. Every time Peter says, "This is worse than the time I," and the screen cuts away, you are watching a real memory from a real experience in a world that runs alongside the show's main continuity. The Cutaway universe is vast and continuous and absolutely insane, and it has been building silently in the background since the first episode. This theory also has an interesting corollary. In Road to the Multiverse, Stewie reveals that he has a device capable of accessing parallel universes. He has visited many of them. He showed Brian a universe where Christianity never existed and science had advanced 1,000 years beyond their own. A Flintstones universe, a Japanese-dominated universe, a Disney universe, a universe where dogs rule and humans are pets, where Brian was immediately tempted to stay. These are presented as discrete, navigable alternate realities that Stewie can access deliberately. But what if the cutaways are just poorly charted areas of the same multiverse? What if Peter's apparent memories of impossible events are not memories at all, but experiences pulled from these adjacent worlds that have somehow overlapped into his consciousness? That would explain a lot. It would explain how Peter can have a memory of, say, working at a lighthouse in the 16th century, which he could not have done in his current lifetime. The memory belongs to a version of Peter from another branch of the multiverse, and it is leaked across the dimensional boundary into the Peter we follow in the main story. This is obviously speculation. The show has never confirmed it, but the show has never denied it either. And Back to the Pilot specifically introduced the idea that cutaway events have their own physical reality within the show's universe. The multiverse theory of the cutaways is one of the most elegant explanations for why the show's internal continuity is, to put it generously, flexible. The multiverse also raises questions about Brian's death and resurrection. In Life of Brian, Brian is killed in what appears to be the main universe, the primary timeline. But Stewie retrieves a time pad from a different version of himself from an adjacent moment in the timeline, and uses it to travel back and prevent the death. What this means, technically, is that the Brian who died is still dead in one branch of the timeline. The Brian who currently exists in the show is not the Brian who died. He is a Brian who was saved in a branching timeline, while somewhere in the multiverse, the original Brian's death stands uncorrected. Does this matter? In practical storytelling terms, no. But in terms of the show's internal metaphysics, in terms of what it means about the nature of death and loss in the Family Guy universe, it is genuinely interesting. Every time Stewie has used his time machine to reverse a consequence or save a life, he has not undone the original event. He has created a new branch where the event was prevented. The original event still happened somewhere. The original Brian is still gone somewhere. The show is haunted by its own alternate timelines in ways that it has never directly acknowledged. Section 9. Quagmire, Joe, and Cleveland. The friend group in full. Peter Griffin's friend group at the Drunken Clam is one of the show's great ensembles. In the early seasons, the dynamic between Peter, Joe Swanson, Glenn Quagmire, and Cleveland Brown had something genuinely rare in ensemble comedy. Each character was defined differently, served a different function, and their contrasting personalities generated friction and warmth in equal measure. Glenn Quagmire is, on his surface, the simplest of the four. His defining characteristic is his sexuality, his relentless, practically inhuman libido, his pursuit of women as an end in itself, the catchphrase that became one of the most recognized sounds in all of animated television. He was born Glenn Quagglechek, a detail revealed in the episode Teagues for Two, and he was obese as a child, which adds a quietly interesting dimension to the later version of the character. He is a former Navy ensign. He and Peter met in the Navy, which is how their friendship predates the show's events, and currently works as an airline pilot, a career that the show has used repeatedly as a vehicle for jokes about his travels and the women he encounters in them. But here's what's actually interesting about Quagmire, and what the show occasionally remembered and then forgot again. Underneath the extreme sexual persona, there is a person of genuine loyalty, surprising sensitivity, and occasional genuine moral courage. When his sister Brenda was in an abusive relationship with a man named Jeff, Quagmire's response was not comedic or deflected. He was genuinely enraged. He protected her. He killed Jeff to end the abuse, and while the show played this as dark comedy, the emotional reality of a brother protecting his sister from violence was allowed to be real and serious for a moment. He had a genuine, deep, unrequited love for a woman named Cheryl Teagues, who was his one true attachment. The one time his almost mechanical sexuality gave way to something that resembled real feeling. The episodes involving her are among the most revealing about who Quagmire might have been had the show been willing to develop him as a complete person, rather than primarily as a vehicle for sexual jokes. His hatred of Brian, while often disproportionate in its expression, has genuine philosophical grounding. Quagmire is, in his own way, an honest man. He does what he does openly and without pretending it's something nobler than it is. Brian, in Quagmire's view, does essentially the same things, pursues his own pleasure, prioritizes himself, treats people as means to his ends, but wraps it all in the language of intellectual and moral superiority. And Quagmire finds that hypocrisy more offensive than the behavior itself. He can't stand that Brian is exactly as shallow as Quagmire is, while constantly pretending to be something more. There is something almost admirable in that position, taken purely on its merits. Quagmire is calling out a fraud. The problem is that the show's version of Quagmire in the later seasons escalated his own behavior to levels that made him equally impossible to hold up as any kind of moral standard. His treatment of women became genuinely disturbing rather than just comically exaggerated. His jealousy of Brian became so consuming that it started to swallow other aspects of his character. He was Flanderized too, but from a different starting point and in a different direction. In his best moments, though, Quagmire is one of the most interesting characters in the show. His voice was based by McFarlane on the rapid-fire delivery style of radio pitchmen from the 1930s and 1940s, which gives him a quality that feels slightly out of time, like a version of mid-century American masculine bravado that has been somehow preserved and released into a present that doesn't quite know what to do with him. Joe Swanson's story is one of the show's more clearly tracked trajectories. When Joe was introduced in the very first season, in the episode A Hero Sits Next Door, he was immediately established as someone the entire neighborhood admired. He had won athletic awards. He was strong, capable, confident. The fact that he was in a wheelchair was a part of who he was, but it didn't define him in the limiting sense. He was cool, he was admired, Peter was jealous of him. The contradiction in Joe's backstory is worth noting. He has told two different stories about how he became paralyzed. In his original version, given in A Hero Sits Next Door, he was injured while confronting the Grinch on Christmas Eve at an orphanage, an absurdist story that fit the show's comedic tone. But in a later episode, he admits that this story was a fabrication, that the actual cause of his paralysis was being shot during an undercover operation at a heroin lab when his cover was blown. The second version is grittier and more realistic, and it was clearly meant to give Joe a more substantive backstory as the show developed him. But the two versions stand in the show's history as mutually contradictory, which is either a continuity error or, if you're feeling generous, a reflection of Joe's complicated relationship with the public story of his injury versus the private truth. Joe's evolution over the show's run is among the least flattering of any character. He went from being the neighbor everyone admired, the one Peter was jealous of, to being a source of disability humor, his wheelchair and physical limitations increasingly becoming the entire basis for jokes about him, rather than just one aspect of a fuller character. His marriage to Bonnie became progressively unhappier, his relationship with his friends increasingly characterized by their condescension rather than genuine respect. The man who walked, or rolled, into the show's first season as someone to look up to spent most of subsequent seasons being looked down on. There was a period, around seasons 8 and 9, when Joe got his legs back through surgery. This was treated as both a comedy premise and a character exploration. What does Joe do when the defining physical fact of his life is removed? The answer the show arrived at was that he becomes insufferably arrogant. He replaces his wheelchair-using friends with a new set of more physically capable companions, and treats his old friends, the people who have known him for years, with contempt. Eventually, the problem is resolved and Joe is returned to his wheelchair, and he apologizes and things go back to roughly normal. It's an episode that could have been genuinely interesting, exploring identity and disability and how much of who we are is tied to the constraints we live within. But the show's interest in those questions was primarily comedic rather than substantive. Cleveland Brown occupies a special place in the show's history because he left. He was part of the original friend group from the beginning, present at the Drunken Clam, involved in the adventures and the misadventures that defined the show's first several seasons. His defining trait in the early seasons was a remarkable calm. Cleveland was the most even-tempered, the least volatile, the one who was most likely to just go along with whatever Peter had decided, rather than offer resistance. The joke was his placidity in the face of escalating chaos. Then, in a pivotal moment in Season 4, it was revealed that Quagmire had been sleeping with Cleveland's wife, Loretta. Cleveland's marriage collapsed. The aftermath of this storyline led directly to the creation of The Cleveland Show, a spin-off that ran from 2009 to 2013, following Cleveland as he returned to his hometown in Virginia and started a new life with a new family. When The Cleveland Show ended, Cleveland simply walked back into Family Guy, the show acknowledging the situation with a certain amount of wry self-awareness about how the spin-off had gone. The reunion episode in Season 13 featured the other characters roasting Cleveland about his time away in a manner that was genuinely funny, precisely because it was honest. Quagmire points out that most people didn't even realize Cleveland had been gone. There's something poignant in that joke, actually. The show is acknowledging that Cleveland's absence from Family Guy was more significant than his spin-off made it feel. Section 10. The Dark Theories. Purgatory, Secret Identities, and What's Really Happening. Alright, this is the section where we go somewhere different, somewhere quieter and stranger. The kind of place you end up when you've watched enough hours of a show and you start noticing things that the show's creators probably didn't intend, or maybe did intend, and are hoping nobody would notice. The Purgatory Theory. This is one of the most persistent and philosophically interesting theories in the Family Guy fan community, and the more you look at it, the harder it becomes to dismiss entirely. The theory goes like this. The Griffin family and their neighbors are not living ordinary lives. They are dead. They died at some point before the show begins, and what the show depicts is their existence in a kind of purgatory, a state between lives, where they are being tested and forced to reckon with the sins of their past lives, trapped in versions of themselves that reflect what they did wrong. The show's escalating cruelty is not a creative failure. It is the nature of purgatory. Over time, things get darker. Characters become more extreme versions of their worst qualities, because that is the process of confronting what you actually are. Versions of the theory assign specific sins to specific characters. Peter is a man of reckless selfishness, trapped in a life where his recklessness perpetually causes chaos he cannot escape. Brian is an intellectual fraud and a moral coward, trapped in the literal body of an animal. A reminder that no matter how sophisticated his self-presentation, he is, at some level, operating on instinct. Lois is a wealthy heiress who chose status over love in her past life, trapped now in a middle-class marriage that she cannot fully accept or fully abandon. Stewie is the most interesting application. He begins as a villain, pure id and malice, but over the course of the show becomes progressively more capable of love and connection. In the purgatory theory, Stewie's arc is a redemption. He is actually working through his purgatorial condition and improving. The theory finds a certain amount of support in the show's tone and the way it escalates. The early seasons, when the characters are warmer and more human, would represent the beginning of their purgatorial journey. The period before the weight of what they are really being punished for has fully descended. As the show progresses and becomes crueler and stranger and less governed by ordinary human logic, that is the purgatory tightening, the characters being ground down further into their essential failures. Whether or not you accept the metaphysical framing, the theory usefully describes something real. The trajectory from the warm, comedic family of the early seasons to the increasingly grotesque, boundary-resistant characters of the later seasons follows a logic that is hard to explain as mere carelessness. It feels at times like it's going somewhere, like the darkness has an intention. The purgatory theory gives that darkness a narrative purpose. Then there's the theory about Stewie's true nature and age. In the show, Stewie is explicitly 1 year old, a baby, an infant, barely past the developmental stage of language acquisition. But Stewie speaks in the complete, formal sentences of an educated adult. He builds advanced mechanical devices. He understands geopolitics, temporal mechanics, emotional psychology, and moral philosophy at levels that no human child of any age has ever demonstrated. One theory proposes that Stewie is not actually a baby at all. He is an adult. Specifically, an adult who has used his own time machine to de-age himself, and who maintains himself in an infant's body because it serves his purposes. It allows him to remain close to Brian without Brian aging and dying. It allows him to observe the Griffins without being subject to the social expectations and demands placed on adults. And it gives him a kind of freedom from consequence that adult identity would not permit. There is a specific version of this theory that connects it to the Stewie de-ages everyone narrative, that Stewie has been periodically resetting the clocks for the entire family, keeping everyone frozen at roughly the same ages so that the world he has built around himself doesn't age away from him. Think about it. Family Guy has been running for over 25 years, but Meg is still a teenager. Chris is still in high school. Peter is still the same age he was in 1999. In a realistic universe, this is impossible. But in a universe where Stewie has access to technology that manipulates time and matter, it is not only possible but would be consistent with what we know about him. The theory that Meg is Stewie's biological mother is perhaps the darkest and most unsettling of the prominent fan theories, and it is genuinely difficult to dismiss outright given the evidence offered for it. The theory suggests that Meg became pregnant at a very young age, and that Lois and Brian conspired to conceal the pregnancy, effectively adopting Meg's child as their own and raising Stewie as Lois's son to spare Meg the consequences of teenage parenthood. It would explain Stewie's strange fixation on Lois, not maternal love returned or mother-killing revenge, but the specific, confused emotional energy of a child directed at a person he was told was his mother, but who is not. And it would explain the particular cruelty that Stewie sometimes shows toward Meg, which might be the cruelty of a child toward the parent who gave him up. There is no conclusive textual evidence for this theory. It is pure inference from adjacently suggestive details. But it is the kind of theory that, once you've heard it, you cannot help noticing moments in the show where it almost fits. Brian writes the show. This is a theory that has been circulating in the fan community for years and has a quiet elegance to it. The suggestion is that Family Guy, within its own universe, is a show that Brian created, that the events we watch are a fictionalized version of Brian's experiences with the Griffin family, dramatized and exaggerated for entertainment. This would explain why Brian is treated with such consistent sympathy in the early seasons, despite being, technically, a pet. It would explain why his perspective often seems privileged in the narrative, why we understand Brian's inner life more fully than any other characters. He's the author. We're reading his version. This theory has textual support as well. There are episodes of Family Guy that literally show the show within a show, that acknowledge the Griffin family as characters in an entertainment product. The season 15 episode Inside Family Guy specifically explores this premise. If you take it seriously, it opens the question of what Brian has edited out of his version of events, what he has made himself seem more sympathetic about, what parts of the story have been shaped by his self-interest as the narrator. The two-universe theory deserves mention because it is perhaps the most structurally satisfying explanation for the show's tonal discontinuity. The theory suggests that the pre-cancellation seasons, 1 through 3, and the post-revival seasons, 4 onward, are not the same universe. They are parallel realities. When Brian and Stewie traveled back to the pilot in Back to the Pilot, they didn't actually travel to their own past. They traveled to the adjacent universe, Universe 1, the original Family Guy, which explains why everything in the post-revival show feels subtly and sometimes dramatically different from the original. The evidence offered for this theory is remarkable in its detail. Meg is treated fundamentally differently. Peter shifts from a lovable fool to a cruel one. The warmth of the original family dynamics is absent in the revival. Small continuity details don't match. Stewie's characteristics evolve in a way that requires a real-world explanation if they don't represent an actual character arc. The two-universe theory gives you permission to love the first 3 seasons and the revival seasons as separate things, connected by continuity of name and appearance but fundamentally distinct in their metaphysics. Section 11. Seth MacFarlane's Universe. Connections, Coincidences, and the Man Himself. The world that Seth MacFarlane built is not just Family Guy, it is American Dad, which premiered in 2005 and has now outlasted and arguably surpassed Family Guy in critical estimation. It is The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013. It is The Orville, the science fiction drama he created and stars in, which began on Fox in 2017. It is the TED Films and television series. It is a body of work that, taken together, represents one of the most prolific creative outputs in the history of American entertainment. And these properties are more connected than their surface similarities might suggest. There has been fan speculation and occasional textual support for the idea that the Family Guy, American Dad, and Cleveland Show universes are not entirely separate. Steve Smith of American Dad has been seen, in at least one episode, watching Family Guy on television and imitating Stewie Griffin's mannerisms. This is the kind of moment that can be explained as a simple joke. Characters in animated shows sometimes watch other animated shows, but it is also the kind of moment that multiverse-minded fans point to as evidence of something more deliberate. The goldfish in American Dad, Klaus, a man whose brain was transplanted into a fish's body by the CIA, is functionally identical in concept to a theory about Brian Griffin that suggests Brian is a human being whose brain was transplanted into a dog's body. Both shows exist in a universe where the CIA has access to technology that allows human consciousness to be placed in animal forms. If the two shows are set in the same universe, then Brian and Klaus might be products of the same covert government program, separated by circumstance and geography. The Kennedy fish theory about Brian is given additional texture by the fact that, in the show's first few seasons, Brian sometimes seemed to briefly drop into dog-like behavior, chasing things, responding to stimuli in animal ways, as if the underlying dog neurology occasionally reasserted itself through the transplanted human consciousness. The Orville is tonally very different from MacFarlane's animated work. It's sincere science fiction with a genuine respect for the genre, drawing heavily on the visual and narrative language of Star Trek. But it shares certain preoccupations with Family Guy that suggest it emerges from the same creative mind. Specifically, it is interested in questions about identity, consciousness, and what it means to be human when the definition of human is in question. The characters of the Orville frequently encounter situations that require them to think carefully about what makes a person, what rights and protections consciousness deserves, and how communities decide who belongs. These questions are, in a more comedic register, at the heart of Brian Griffin's entire existence. The fact that MacFarlane based Stewie's voice on Rex Harrison, specifically on Harrison's performance in My Fair Lady, is a detail that opens an interesting interpretive window. My Fair Lady is about a girl from a working-class background who is given an aristocratic education, specifically an aristocratic accent and manner, and the complicated question of whether this transformation changes who she really is. Stewie is a working-class family's baby who speaks and acts like a British aristocrat. His accent and manner are, in a sense, a costume, a performance of a class identity that he has chosen rather than inherited. Whether Stewie's refined persona is authentically his, or a kind of elaborate performance, is a question. The show dances around for 20-plus seasons. And then there is the remarkable biographical fact that hangs over all of MacFarlane's work, particularly the earlier seasons of Family Guy. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, Seth MacFarlane was booked on American Airlines Flight 11. He missed the flight by approximately 10 minutes, a combination of a hangover from the night before where he had been lecturing at his alma mater, and an error by his travel agent who had given him the wrong departure time resulted in him arriving at the gate just as it was closing. Flight 11 was the first plane to strike the World Trade Center's North Tower. Everyone on board was killed. MacFarlane woke up in the airport lounge approximately 45 minutes after falling asleep to the sound of people around him reacting to what had just happened. He learned that the flight he had missed had just crashed into the tower. He called his assistant to say he was taking a different plane, but the message wasn't received until 20 minutes after the attacks, leaving people who knew he had been booked on that flight in a period of genuine fear that he was dead. The psychological weight of this experience is difficult to overstate. You survive by minutes, through a combination of coincidence and error. Everything you would go on to create, all of it, nearly didn't exist. The shows, the films, the songs, the awards, the cultural impact, none of it happens if the travel agent gives the right departure time. If MacFarlane hadn't gone out the night before, if he'd had slightly better sleep and gotten to the airport earlier. Some fans have theorized that this experience left visible marks on the show. The episode Back to the Pilot, in which Brian explicitly prevents 9/11 from happening, and then is forced to undo that prevention because the altered timeline causes worse consequences, is hard to watch without thinking about MacFarlane's personal connection to that day. The show is acknowledging, in its oblique and comedic way, that the day was real and significant and that the creator survived it. And it is engaging with the question of whether one should try to undo terrible things, or whether doing so creates new terrible things. It's a deeply personal episode for a show that rarely wore its personal stakes on its sleeve. There is also a theory, widely circulated, that the direct-to-video film Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, which was produced in 2005, 4 years after 9/11, contains imagery that functions as MacFarlane's attempt to process his feelings about having been almost on Flight 11. The film includes content that some fans read as allegorical engagement with themes of near-death, alternative timelines, and the weight of surviving something that others didn't. Whether MacFarlane intended this reading or not is something only he could confirm. But the biographical reality of his 9/11 experience gives everything he created after it a contextual weight that is worth holding in mind. American Dad and Family Guy being created by the same person at roughly the same time, running in parallel for years, offers one of the most interesting natural comparisons in the history of television. Both shows are animated. Both are centered on suburban families. Both feature a lead character who is a blunt, sometimes reckless man with strong convictions and poor self-awareness. Both use satire as a primary tool, but the tonal and creative choices made in each show's writing room over the years produced radically different results. American Dad made a decision early on not to use cutaway gags. This single structural choice forced the writing staff to generate comedy through character and situation rather than through disconnected asides. It meant that every funny moment had to emerge from the plot, had to involve the characters in ways that advanced or complicated the story. It was harder. It required more craft. And the result, over the show's long run, was a tighter, more narratively coherent show that developed its characters in ways Family Guy increasingly did not. Stan Smith, American Dad's lead character, started as what looked like a one-dimensional conservative caricature, a joke about CIA agents and American political excess. But he was allowed to actually develop. Over the seasons, Stan's rigidity softened without disappearing. His relationship with his son Steve and his wife Francine became genuinely complex. He was wrong about things in ways the show allowed to have real consequences. He grew episodically in ways that persisted into subsequent episodes rather than being erased by a reset button. Roger the Alien, the show's most wild card, became one of the great creative successes in the MacFarlane universe. His ability to assume completely different identities, each one a fully realized character with its own history, personality, and manner, gave the writers an inexhaustible source of material. Every season, every episode, Roger could be someone new. The possibilities genuinely never ran out, because the concept was designed to expand rather than narrow. He is the inverse of what happened to Stewie, where Stewie's concept was contracted over time until what remained was a simplified version of the original. Roger's concept was expanded until it became the most creative engine on the show. Section 12. The Legacy, the Future, and What It All Means. We have traveled a long way together through this story. From a small town in Connecticut and a young man who drew cartoons as a child, through a Rhode Island art school and a Hanna-Barbera writing room, and a pilot pitched to Fox in 1998, through 22 million viewers and a canceled show and Adult Swim reruns and DVD sales and a resurrection that nobody saw coming, and a second resurrection after that. Through the golden years and the long middle period, and the character transformations and the rating declines, and the Thursday night to Sunday night to Wednesday night journey. Through the theories and the dark readings and the biographical facts that cast everything else in a different light. What is Family Guy's legacy, and what does it mean? Let's start with what it unambiguously changed. Before Family Guy, animated comedy for adults on American broadcast television was essentially The Simpsons. The Simpsons had demonstrated that animation was not just for children, that animated characters could be layered and funny in adult ways, that the medium could carry real satirical weight. But The Simpsons was fundamentally a family sitcom, warm, relatively plot-oriented, driven by character relationships in recognizable ways. Family Guy broke from that model in ways that were immediately influential and not always for the better. The cutaway gag, however maligned it later became, was a genuinely innovative comedy structure. It allowed the show to pack more jokes per minute than any animated series had previously managed. It created a new rhythm for televised comedy that dozens of subsequent shows would try to emulate. The random, associative quality of Family Guy's humor, the way it jumped from genre to genre, from high to low, from sophisticated reference to cheap gag without warning, was a specific aesthetic that influenced an entire generation of comedy writers. The show also proved something important about the home video and cable rerun market. Its death and resurrection demonstrated that a show's initial broadcast ratings are not the only measure of its value, that audiences can find things after the fact and fall in love with them deeply enough to demand their continuation. This lesson was not lost on the television industry, and the Family Guy revival can reasonably be credited with making network executives more willing to look at secondary market data and streaming performance as indicators of show viability, rather than relying solely on first-run broadcast numbers. The show's influence on internet culture is enormous and probably not fully appreciated. Family Guy was among the first television programs to truly benefit from early video sharing. Short clips circulated before YouTube even existed, through email and early sharing sites. When YouTube launched in 2005, the same year Family Guy returned for its fourth season, the show's clip culture was already established, and the two things grew together. Family Guy taught a generation of internet users that the clip, the moment, the isolated funny thing, was a form of entertainment in itself. The full episode was one way to experience the show. The individual clip, watched 50 times and shared 100 more, was another. In 2025, Family Guy reportedly accumulated over 3 billion minutes of streaming watch time in the United States alone. 3 billion minutes. For a show that averages roughly 700,000 first-run broadcast viewers per new episode in its most recent seasons. The gap between those two numbers tells you everything about what the show has become. Not a first-run broadcast event, but a vast reservoir of content that people return to constantly. Not always for the new episodes, but for the accumulated weight of everything that came before. The Stewie spin-off, announced in 2026 for premiere in the 2027 to 2028 season, is the clearest evidence yet that the Family Guy universe is being actively expanded rather than wound down. Seth MacFarlane and Kirker Butler's new show will follow Stewie in preschool, using his array of time and space travel devices to take his miserable new classmates on adventures beyond the ordinary. The premise is clever in that it solves what had become a creative problem with Stewie in the main show. How do you give Stewie meaningful stories when his character has evolved so far from his original premise? You give him a new context that is his alone, where his specific combination of brilliance, misanthropy, and technological capability has room to define the entire narrative rather than being one element among many. Whether the spin-off will manage to recover something of the original Stewie's edge while preserving the emotional depth of the evolved version is genuinely unknowable right now. McFarlane's involvement as executive producer and voice actor suggests a personal investment that goes beyond the contractual. His statement at the show's announcement, that he was excited to start pretending to collaborate closely on it, carries his characteristically dry, self-deprecating humor, but also a hint of genuine anticipation. He is returning to a character he created and voicing him in a new context. That tends to matter to creators. Family Guy was renewed in 2025 in a deal with Disney, which now owns 20th Television Animation, for 4 additional seasons through the 2028 to 2029 television year, coinciding with the show's 30th anniversary. 30 years. Seth MacFarlane was 24 when he pitched the pilot. He will be 55 when that anniversary arrives. The young animator from Kent, Connecticut, will have been making variations on the same characters for a third of a century. What does it say about a show that it persists for 30 years? Several things simultaneously, and not all of them flattering. It says that the property has value, financial value, brand value, cultural recognition value, that survives the decline of any individual creative quality. Family Guy is an institution now in the way that very few entertainment products become institutions. It exists as a reference point, a cultural shorthand, a collection of images and sounds and phrases that are recognizable even to people who have never watched a full episode. That is rare. That is genuinely rare. The show has a presence in the culture that is out of proportion to its current viewership because its presence was established during the years when it was genuinely extraordinary, and it has persisted beyond those years through the force of accumulated cultural momentum. It says something about the economics of animation, which are fundamentally different from live-action television. The cost to produce a season of Family Guy is small relative to what a live-action show of equivalent cultural significance would cost. There are no sets, no location shoots, no complex physical stunts, no stars demanding film-level salaries. The voice cast records their lines in booths. The animation is done largely overseas. The infrastructure is lean. And when a property produces revenue through streaming rights, rerun licensing, merchandise, gaming, and a dozen other channels simultaneously, the calculation about whether to continue it is not primarily about whether the new episodes are creatively vital. It's about whether the machine continues to generate returns. And it says something about the relationship between a creator and their creation that, once a show reaches a certain size and duration, it outlives the creator's desire to make it in the same way that a family business sometimes outlives the founder's passion. The show goes on because it can go on, because the momentum is too great to simply stop, because the infrastructure exists and the contracts are signed, and there are people whose livelihoods depend on it continuing. Seth MacFarlane has been honest about this. He said in 2024 that he doesn't see a good reason to end the show because people still enjoy it, and it funds causes he cares about. He framed it in terms of financial utility and audience satisfaction, rather than in terms of stories he urgently needs to tell. That is the honest position of a man 25 years removed from the urgency that created the original. But here's the thing about Family Guy that resists the summary of decline, that complicates any simple narrative of a golden age followed by a long falling off. The show is still there. It is still being made, still being watched, still generating the conversations and arguments and theories that you've been listening to for the past several hours. The early seasons, seasons 1 through 3, are objectively and uncommonly brilliant. They hold up, not as nostalgia objects, not as artifacts from a simpler time, but as genuinely well-crafted pieces of comedic television that understand their own characters and care about what happens to them. Brian and Stewie in the bank vault in Brian and Stewie, Season 8 having the most honest conversation of the entire show. Peter standing outside the house at the end of an episode, looking through the window at his family, and the emotion on his face that's complicated and real. The road to episodes, particularly Road to Rhode Island and Road to the Multiverse, which are as good as anything in American animated television. These things didn't stop existing when the show went through its various struggles. They're still there. And there is something beautiful and strange about a show that has lasted this long, that has accumulated this much history, that has been loved and argued about and theorized over and quoted and memed and cited as an example of both television's potential and its failures. Family Guy is not just a show about a dysfunctional family in a fictional New England town. It is a record of 25 years of American humor, American anxieties, American family life as seen through a funhouse mirror, animated by hundreds of people over decades, driven by a creator who is in some ways too successful to stay fully engaged with his original creation, and in other ways too attached to it to let it go. The Griffin family is still on Spooner Street. Peter is still large and loud and often unkind, though the show has pulled him back from the worst of his later seasons. Brian is still drinking at the kitchen counter, still working on something, still the most articulate voice in a household that mostly speaks in impulses. Stewie is building something in his bedroom, something that uses technology that shouldn't exist in a house in a small New England town, and he will probably be doing the same thing in his own spin-off show 2 years from now. Meg is still there, and she is better now, more defended, more capable of standing her ground, though the wounds of a decade of abuse don't simply vanish, because the episode stopped. Chris is still drawing. Lois is still holding things together by threads she refuses to let go of. And somewhere outside the house, on a street that has seen 25 years of improbable events, Glenn Quagmire is telling a story, and Joe Swanson is laughing in that voice that fills the room. And Cleveland is back from wherever he went and glad to be home. And the four of them are sitting at a bar in a town that doesn't exist, living lives that were supposed to be canceled in 2002. Existing because against all logic and expectation, people loved them enough to bring them back. That is not nothing. That is actually quite a lot. The golden years were golden because someone who cared deeply about what he was making built something genuinely worth caring about. And the strange, complicated decades that followed are worth understanding, worth sitting with, worth thinking through. Because the story of how a brilliant show navigates its own success and longevity is a story that says real things about creativity, about commerce, about what art costs when it becomes industry, and about the enduring power of characters who feel real enough to argue about for a quarter of a century. You have spent these hours in the world of Family Guy, in the town on the small street in the fictional New England town that no longer shares a name with anything in this story, with a family that was never real and somehow always was. Sleep well. And the next time you find yourself watching one of those early episodes, the ones from the first 3 seasons, when everything was still being built and the edges were still rough and the warmth was still unconditional, pay attention. Really pay attention. Because that warmth is the thing. That's what it was all for. That's what made the rest of it, for better and for worse, worth watching at all. If you made it to the end of this, or drifted off somewhere in the middle and woke up near the end, which is entirely the point, I want to say thank you. Genuinely. This channel runs on people who care enough about deep, slow, story-driven content to spend real time with it, and you are those people. If you enjoyed this and want to see more breakdowns like this, subscribe. It's free and it keeps this whole thing going. Drop a comment below. Tell me your time and place again if you want, or tell me which section hit you hardest, or which theory you're still thinking about. I read all of them. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you in the next one. End of script. Uncle Guy lore optimized for 11 labs. Voiceover generation, estimated runtime, 3 to 3.5 hours at standard narration pace. Expanded. Section 2. Additional, the supporting cast and the town itself. The town that Family Guy is set in, the fictional Rhode Island community where the Griffins live, has a geography and a supporting population that are worth exploring in detail, because one of the things the early seasons did exceptionally well was build a world that felt inhabited rather than assembled for the convenience of plot. The streets had residents. The businesses had histories. The town had institutions that persisted from episode to episode in ways that created genuine continuity. Spooner Street itself is worth dwelling on. The Griffins live at number 31. Joe and Bonnie Swanson are at number 33, immediately next door. Quagmire is at number 29 on the other side. The proximity of these households, the way the neighbors are literally within calling distance of each other, is the structural fact that makes the group dynamic at the Drunken Clam feel organic. These people don't just choose to spend time together, they are embedded in the same small geography, their lives constantly overlapping in the way that neighbor lives do in close neighborhoods. Cleveland, in the early seasons, lives on the same street, though his house is positioned slightly differently in different episodes, an inconsistency the show never bothered to resolve, and which doesn't need to be resolved because the important thing is the sense that these four men live within walking distance of each other and have done so for years. The neighborhood's other recurring figures deserve acknowledgement. Herbert, the elderly man who lives nearby and whose interest in Chris and other young boys is one of the show's most persistently dark recurring jokes, is voiced by McFarlane with a specific quality of sweet, sinister menace that makes him genuinely funny and genuinely uncomfortable simultaneously. Mayor Adam West, voiced by the actual Adam West, the actor who played Batman in the 1960s television series until his death in 2017, was one of the show's great recurring characters. A man who seemed to be genuinely disconnected from ordinary reality in ways that were hilarious and occasionally almost poignant. He named a city street after himself while he was still living. He responded to civic emergencies with philosophically circular logic that somehow resolved into action. He was the kind of mayor that a town in a cartoon deserves. Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons at the local news station provided the show with a recurring frame for how the town processed its own events. Mort Goldman at the pharmacy, Dr. Hartman at the medical practice, the parade of recurring figures who populated the town's businesses and institutions. All of these characters contributed to the sense that the world had more people in it than the main family, that life was happening at every address on every street. The Drunken Clam deserves specific mention. It is the bar where Peter, Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland spend the majority of their social time, and like all great fictional bars and great fictional works, it functions as more than just a setting. It is a space where the normal rules of life are slightly suspended, where men who spend their days managing the demands of work and family and responsibility can sit and drink beer and talk without the pressure of any of those contexts. The bar is the place where they are just themselves, and what they are when they are just themselves is, in the early seasons, warm and funny and recognizably human. The ownership and management of the Drunken Clam changes at various points in the show's run, with a black character named Jerome eventually taking over the bar, which became the premise for the Season 8 episode Jerome is the New Black, the episode of Quagmire's speech about Brian. The bar's role in the show's social ecosystem shifted as the friend group's dynamics changed. But in the early seasons, it was central to why the four men felt like a genuine friend group rather than just characters who happened to share scenes. Peter's workplace history is also worth tracing. He began the series working at the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory in an undefined role, and it was there, as mentioned, that his friendship with Joe was cemented when the factory needed a baseball player. After various adventures and misadventures, Peter eventually ends up working at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, which manufactures Pawtucket Patriot Ale, his favorite beer. The brewery becomes a more consistent setting in the later seasons, providing Peter with a workplace that has its own recurring cast of characters, including his stern boss Angela and his essentially verbal coworker Opie, whose communication style is somewhat more abstract than standard English. The show's relationship with Providence, Rhode Island as a real place is interesting. McFarlane set the show in his college town, giving it the specific texture of New England, the accent, the sensibility, the visual landscape, without being literally tied to any real location. Rhode Island as a state is small and relatively obscure in the national imagination, which gives the setting a quality of authentic specificity without the burden of constant comparison to a well-known place. It allowed the show to be geographically specific without being geographically accountable. The James Woods connection. The actor James Woods appears repeatedly as himself in the show, with an established arc involving his rivalry with Peter that was developed over multiple seasons, is one of the show's more interesting, long-running bits. Woods appeared frequently enough that his recurring presence became part of the show's identity, part of the specific texture of the town's relationship with celebrity and fame. The fact that James Woods himself was willing to participate in this self-deprecating and sometimes unflattering recurring role said something good about his sense of humor and his willingness to engage with the show's comedy on its own terms. Expanded Section 3. Additional, what the Adult Swim years taught the industry. The story of Family Guy's survival through the Adult Swim years deserves more careful examination than it usually receives, because the mechanisms of what happened were genuinely new and have had lasting consequences for how the television industry thinks about audience value and the relationship between programming and its viewers. Adult Swim as a concept was itself a bet on a demographic that broadcast television had largely ignored or mishandled. Young adults, particularly young men, in the late night hours when they were still awake and looking for something to watch that wasn't the standard late night programming. The block launched in 2001 with shows that were aggressively unconventional, that didn't follow the rules of broadcast television animation, that had a rough, lo-fi quality that felt genuinely countercultural rather than produced by a large studio trying to simulate counterculture. Family Guy was different from everything else that had aired on Adult Swim. It was professionally produced with high-quality animation and well-known voice talent. It had been a network show with a real budget. It had a specific comedic sensibility that was more polished than the lo-fi aesthetics that characterized the block's original programming. In theory, it was too mainstream for Adult Swim's identity. In practice, it was exactly what Adult Swim's audience had been waiting for, without knowing they were waiting for it. The combination of professional production quality with genuinely adult, sometimes transgressive content, humor that network television, even Fox, had kept slightly moderated, was precisely what the late-night demographic was hungry for. Family Guy on Adult Swim was the best version of itself, seen by the people who would appreciate it most, in a context that wasn't trying to make it something it wasn't. The DVD market was the second front. In 2003, when the first and second season sets were released, the home video market for television was undergoing a significant structural change. Consumers were beginning to buy television seasons the way they bought movies, as objects to own, to watch repeatedly, to share with others. For a show like Family Guy, which rewarded repeat viewing and contained jokes that worked better on the third or fourth viewing than on the first, the DVD format was ideal. People were discovering the show, buying it, and then sharing it, lending the discs, giving them as gifts, using them as a way to introduce friends to something they were enthusiastic about. This organic spread, person to person, disc to disc, conversation to conversation, was not a marketing campaign. It was not manufactured. It was people who genuinely loved something telling other people who they thought would genuinely love it. This is the most durable kind of audience growth, and it is the kind that produces the deep loyalty that kept Family Guy's fan base together through 2 cancellations and brought them back for the revival. What the television industry learned from this was not immediately applied because institutions are slow to learn. But the lesson was there. A show's initial broadcast ratings are a measure of how many people happen to find it in the time slot it was given, competing against whatever else was on that night. They are not a measure of the show's actual worth or the depth of its potential audience. A show can be genuinely beloved by a large number of people who simply never managed to find it under the broadcast conditions it was given. The streaming economy that now governs television was built, in part, on this insight. When Netflix and then every other streaming platform began acquiring content and commissioning originals, they were operating on a fundamental premise that the Family Guy resurrection had proved. Audience and audience finding are separate problems, and you cannot judge the first by how well you solved the second. Expanded Section 5. Additional, the Brian and Stewie relationship in full depth. The relationship between Brian and Stewie is the show's most sustained and emotionally complex creative achievement, and it deserves more space than any summary of the show's character dynamics usually gives it. In the early seasons, Brian's relationship with Stewie was defined primarily by a quality that distinguished it from everyone else's relationship with the baby. Brian understood him. The show established early on that most of the Griffin household did not register Stewie's sophisticated speech. They heard infant vocalizations, babbling, the sounds of a normal baby. Brian heard sentences. Brian could respond. Brian could have actual conversations with the 1-year-old who was plotting world domination. And while Brian was understandably wary of Stewie's true nature, the fact of being understood was fundamental to Stewie's experience. Think about what it would mean to be Stewie in those early seasons if you take his perspective seriously. You are a being of extraordinary intelligence trapped in the body of an infant. You are physically helpless, dependent on adults for every basic function. You cannot drive or shop or move independently through the world. You have the mental and emotional life of an adult, or something beyond an adult, but you are contained within a form that renders you powerless. Everyone around you treats you as what you appear to be rather than what you are. Except Brian. Brian knows. Brian hears. Brian engages with the actual Stewie rather than the surface Stewie. In a life full of people who fundamentally misread him, Brian was the one correct reader. That is a profound thing to have, and it was the foundation on which everything else in their relationship was built. As the seasons went on and Stewie evolved away from the pure evil genius persona, the relationship between him and Brian became richer and more complicated. The road to episodes, which placed them together in isolated adventure contexts, were the laboratory in which this relationship was most fully explored. Road to Rhode Island gave us the first real intimacy between them. Stewie's vulnerability about his relationship with Lois, Brian's vulnerability about his relationship with his mother. Road to Europe expanded the adventure geography and deepened the dynamic. Road to the Multiverse gave them the universe-hopping premise that produced some of the show's finest comedy, while also showing how differently they processed extraordinary experiences. Brian was always wanting to stay somewhere easier, somewhere that seemed like it offered more comfort or freedom. Stewie was always pulling them back, insisting on returning to their own world no matter how strange it was. That dynamic, Brian's tendency toward escape and Stewie's insistence on return, says something interesting about each of them. Brian, for all his sophistication and apparent groundedness, was always looking for somewhere better. A universe where he was appreciated, where he was the dominant species, where the conditions of his life were different. Stewie, for all his apparent misanthropy and his stated desire to escape the constraints of his domestic existence, always needed to go home. The adventure was the point, and the destination was always the same kitchen, the same crib, the same family. Stewie's relationship with the Griffin household, despite all his complaints about it, was something he could not give up. The Season 8 episode Brian and Stewie, the show's 150th episode, made to mark the milestone, is the most intimate and the most emotionally serious thing Family Guy ever produced. Brian and Stewie are locked in a bank vault over the weekend, entirely alone, with nothing to do but talk. The episode has no cutaways, no other characters appear, no subplot runs alongside the main story. It is purely two characters in a room having honest conversations about their lives, and their relationship and their fears. In the vault, Brian reveals that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box. He has thought about using it on himself. His depression is real and has been real for a long time. The bottle of scotch and the revolver are there for the days when he might not be able to stop himself. He has not used them yet, but they are there because he is not certain he will always be strong enough to resist. Stewie's response to this revelation is the most purely loving thing he ever does in the show's entire run. He is not dramatic about it. He is not performatively comforting. He simply makes clear, in his specific and particular way, that Brian's death would be something he could not survive. Not metaphorically, but literally. He needs Brian, not in the way children need their parents or people need comfort. He needs Brian the way a person needs the one relationship in their life that actually sees them. This episode proved conclusively that the show's best work happened when it committed fully to character over spectacle. No cutaways, no randomness, just two beings in a room telling each other the truth. The episode was widely regarded as one of the finest things the show ever produced and remains a benchmark for what animated comedy can achieve when it chooses depth over breadth. Expanded Section 8. Additional, The Simpsons crossover and what it revealed. In 2014, Family Guy produced a crossover episode with The Simpsons, titled The Simpsons Guy. Peter and the Griffin family visit Springfield. The Griffins meet the Simpsons. Homer and Peter discover they share a mutual interest in beer and quickly become friends. The families interact in various configurations. And at the episode's climax, Peter and Homer engage in a long, extended version of the fight that Peter has periodically with Ernie the Giant Chicken. A brawl that goes everywhere, destroys everything, and ends with Peter and Homer having forgotten what they were fighting about. The episode was technically well produced and functioned as good-natured rivalry comedy between the two most iconic animated sitcom families in television history. But it also revealed, somewhat unintentionally, the degree to which the two shows had diverged in their relationship to their own characters. In the crossover, The Simpsons characters felt coherent and consistent. Homer was clearly Homer. Lisa was clearly Lisa. The characterizations matched their established selves without feeling like approximations. The Family Guy characters, in contrast, felt slightly uncertain, as if the writers were recreating them from outside rather than working from an intimate knowledge of who they were. This was particularly visible in how Meg and Lisa interacted. Their scene together was one of the episode's genuine highlights, suggesting that the two characters had more in common than either show usually acknowledged, and that both had been underserved by their respective narratives. The Simpsons has its own complicated relationship with flanderization and with maintaining character consistency over long seasons. But The Simpsons, at its worst, still has a version of its original characters present in the writing. Family Guy, at its worst, had replaced its characters so thoroughly that it was unclear whether the originals were still there to be recovered. The crossover forced a direct comparison, and the comparison was instructive. Expanded Section 10. Additional, the Giant Chicken and what it means. Ernie the Giant Chicken is one of Family Guy's most persistently strange recurring elements, and the fan theories about what Ernie represents are among the most interpretively rich in the show's body of lore. Ernie first appeared in the early seasons as the source of a seemingly simple joke. He gave Peter an expired coupon, Peter was furious about it, and a massive fight ensued. The fight went through the entire town, destroyed enormous amounts of property, apparently killed Ernie, and then resolved with Peter returning to the scene of whatever he had been doing before, battered and bruised, picking up exactly where he left off as if nothing had happened. Then, in a coda, Ernie's apparently dead body would move, revealing that he was still alive. Foreshadowing the next fight. Over the seasons, the giant chicken fights became more elaborate and more cinematically ambitious. They parodied action films. They went through submarines, airports, shopping malls, outer space. They involved collateral damage on an increasingly spectacular scale. And they followed the same basic structure every time. Peter and Ernie spot each other. The fight begins without preamble. They go everywhere, Peter wins, Ernie is not dead. By the later seasons, the two had actually had a moment of reconciliation. Ernie brought Peter to dinner to make amends for the original expired coupon, introduced his wife Nicole, and the conflict seemed to be resolved. Then it resumed because Peter and Ernie argued over who would pay the bill at dinner. The entire sustained series of catastrophic battles that had destroyed significant portions of the town resulted in untold casualties among bystanders, and constituted one of the most absurd ongoing plots in television history, was reignited because of an argument about who was buying dinner. The theories about Ernie's significance go in several directions. The simplest is that Ernie represents the arbitrary and meaningless conflicts that consume enormous amounts of human energy. The original coupon was a trivial matter that escalated into sustained warfare precisely because neither party was willing to let it go. And the resumption of hostilities over a dinner check is a perfect illustration of how meaningless conflicts regenerate from any available source once the pattern is established. Peter and Ernie don't fight because of the coupon anymore, or because of the dinner check. They fight because they fight. The reason has been irrelevant for years. The behavior has its own momentum. A darker reading suggests that the giant chicken is a projection of Peter's own aggression and destructive impulses. That Ernie is, in some sense, the externalized form of everything in Peter that is violent and chaotic and indiscriminate. The battles always happen when Peter is in the middle of something unrelated. They always pull him completely out of the context of his regular life and into a space of pure violence. And afterward, he always returns to that regular life as if nothing has happened. Because for Peter, the violence didn't disrupt anything real. It was always there. Ernie is just the form it takes. The in-universe lore of the giant chicken also has a detail worth noting. Peter, after the first fight, refused ever again to accept coupons from any chicken. He informed Lois that the chicken incident had fundamentally changed his policy on chicken-related commercial offers. This is an entirely logical response that is also completely insane, and it is somehow one of the most human things Peter Griffin ever did in the entire show. The giant chicken was confirmed, as of the most recent seasons, to be officially dead, a development the show treated with some ceremony. Whether this is truly final, given Ernie's long history of improbable survival, remains to be seen. Expanded Section 11. Additional, MacFarlane's other voices and the characters they reveal. Seth MacFarlane voices 4 of the main characters in Family Guy: Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire. 4 characters with 4 completely distinct vocal personalities, 4 completely distinct comedic registers, 4 ways of being in the world. The fact that these voices come from the same person is both technically remarkable and interpretively interesting. Peter's voice is based on a security guard MacFarlane knew at the Rhode Island School of Design, a Boston area working-class accent with a quality of good-natured obtuseness that MacFarlane rendered with precision and affection. It is a voice that communicates volume and certainty without intelligence, warmth, and aggression simultaneously. It is the voice of a man who does not fully understand the world, but navigates it with complete confidence anyway. Brian's voice is the most personal of the 4. It is essentially MacFarlane's own speaking voice, slightly lower, slightly more relaxed, but unmistakably close to how he actually sounds in interviews. This is not an accident. Brian, as we have discussed, began as the show's moral center and most sympathetic character. Making him sound like himself was MacFarlane's way of making Brian the character he most identified with, the one who saw things most clearly, the one who felt things in the register that MacFarlane felt them. Stewie's voice, based on Rex Harrison's Henry Higgins, is a studied performance of British aristocratic auteur, precisely calibrated to create the maximum gap between the baby's physical reality and his apparent cultural register. MacFarlane has described developing the voice as a specific technical process, finding the exact quality of refinement and barely concealed contempt that made the comedy work, that made the contrast between the infant form and the adult consciousness land as funny rather than merely bizarre. Quagmire's voice, based on the radio pitchmen of the 1930s and 1940s, is perhaps the most technically difficult of the 4. The rapid-fire delivery, the specific quality of the insinuating confidence, the way the voice carries its particular brand of mid-century masculinity, these are things that require genuine craft to maintain consistently across hundreds of episodes over decades. The fact that MacFarlane voices all 4 means that in ensemble scenes where 2 or more of these characters speak together, he is effectively having conversations with himself, performing both sides of an exchange, calibrating the timing and the chemistry between characters who all live in his voice. This is an unusual creative situation, and it has implications for how the characters relate to each other. They are all, in some sense, aspects of the same mind made distinct through performance. The interpretation of the 4 voices as aspects of a single personality has attracted some fan theorizing. Peter as id, Brian as ego, Stewie as superego, Quagmire as the shadow self. All 4 represent the voices in one head projected outward onto the screen as separate characters who then interact with each other in ways that enact the conflicts that any individual consciousness contains. This is probably more credit than MacFarlane was trying to claim, but it is not a reading that the show actively contradicts, and it gives the ensemble a kind of internal coherence that makes sense. Expanded Section 12. Additional, the show's relationship with music. One aspect of Family Guy that is regularly underappreciated is the quality and ambition of its original musical content. The show produced elaborate original song and dance numbers, parodies of Broadway musicals, original score compositions by Walter Murphy and Ron Jones, that gave the show's emotional moments a musical vocabulary that most animated comedies don't attempt. This musical dimension is part of what made the show feel, at its best, like something more fully realized than the average cartoon. Seth MacFarlane's personal love of big band music and jazz standards, he has released multiple albums of his own recordings in this genre, gave the show a musical sensibility that was specific and unusual. The references to mid-century American popular music, the comfort with show tunes and musical theater forms, the willingness to have characters break into elaborate original musical numbers, all of this came from the creator's genuine passion for a musical tradition that most of his contemporaries were not engaging with. You've got a lot to learn from Road to Rhode Island. The song Brian and Stewie sing about their adventure is one of the most frequently cited examples of the show's musical quality at its peak. It has the proper structure and harmonic vocabulary of a classic Broadway number, executed with enough genuine craft that it works as a piece of music independent of its context in the episode. The Christmas episodes, which tend to feature the most elaborate musical production, demonstrate consistently that the show's investment in original musical content was genuine rather than just a comedy device. The music in these episodes is sometimes better than the episodes themselves, more emotionally honest, more technically assured, more willing to go somewhere real. The Simpsons had a strong musical tradition as well, but Family Guy's musical vocabulary was different, more rooted in American popular song of the 1940s and 1950s, more comfortable with the specific structures of Broadway, less oriented toward the rock and pop tradition that The Simpsons most often referenced. This gave Family Guy a quality of mild temporal displacement in its musical imagination, a nostalgia for forms that its primarily young audience had mostly encountered secondhand. Expanded Section 9. Additional, The Drunken Clam and the Philosophy of the Neighborhood Bar. The Drunken Clam deserves sustained attention as a space and as a social institution, because it functions in the show as something that good neighborhood bars function as in real life. A place where the hierarchies and pressures of daily life are temporarily suspended, where men can be something simpler and more honest than the roles they perform everywhere else. In the early seasons, the Drunken Clam scenes had a quality of genuine warmth and easy intimacy. The four men sat around the same table, drank the same beer, told the same kinds of stories. Nobody was performing for anyone. Peter was not trying to impress Joe or Quagmire the way he sometimes tried to impress Lois at home. Joe was not performing capability or competence. Quagmire was not performing his public persona. Cleveland was not being the least volatile person in the room as a deliberate strategy. They were just themselves, and their being themselves was comfortable and funny and real. The bar also functioned as a space where the show could do something it was often too busy elsewhere to do. Let the characters talk. In the Drunken Clam scenes, especially in the early seasons, there were conversations that had nothing to do with the episode's plot. Conversations that existed purely to reveal how these men thought and felt and related to each other. These moments accumulated into a portrait of a friendship that had depth and history and would survive the ordinary frictions of shared lives. As the show changed, the Drunken Clam changed with it. The conversations became less revelatory and more functional. The scenes that used to establish and develop the friendship dynamic became scenes that delivered information or set up the episode's plot. The bar became a backdrop rather than a space. This is a small thing, but it is the kind of small thing that, accumulated over many episodes, changes the feel of a show significantly. The ownership change, when Jerome took over the bar from its previous owner, introduced new dynamics and new comedy, but also shifted the show's relationship with the space. Jerome as a character had genuine potential that the show only partially realized, and his tenure as proprietor of the Drunken Clam was one of the later show's more interesting recurring developments. Expanded Section 12. Additional, What Remains and Why It Matters. There is a version of the story of Family Guy that is purely a story of decline. A brilliant early run followed by a long, painful, commercially driven erosion that turned everything good about the original into something unrecognizable. This version of the story is supported by a lot of evidence, and it is not wrong. But there is another version of the story, and it lives alongside the first version in any honest accounting of what the show is and what it has done. The other version goes like this. Family Guy was, for its first 3 seasons, among the finest animated comedies ever made for American broadcast television. It built characters who felt real, generated comedy from the truth of those characters, and produced a handful of individual episodes that belong on any serious list of the best work the medium has ever produced. This achievement is permanent. It does not become less true because of what came after. It also goes like this. The show's revival in 2005, despite its complications, produced another significant body of work. The Road to Episodes. Road to the Multiverse. Brian and Stewie. The Stewie Kills Lois two-parter. Moments scattered through the post-revival seasons that show what the show was still capable of when it committed to quality over spectacle. These moments are real and they are good, and they belong in any complete account of the show's legacy. And it goes like this. The fan response to Family Guy over 25 years has generated a body of creative engagement, theories, analysis, argument, love, disappointment, reassessment. That is itself a cultural phenomenon. People have spent enormous amounts of thought and feeling on this show. The theories about Stewie's real age, about the purgatory the characters may inhabit, about Brian's true nature, about what the cutaways actually are. These are the products of real intellectual engagement with a fictional world, and they testify to the depth of the connection the show forged with its audience. A show that generates that kind of engagement is not a failure. A show that was watched by 22 million people on its premiere night, canceled twice, revived twice, ran for 30 years, produced a cultural footprint visible in every animated comedy that followed it, and inspired enough love from its fans to generate theories and arguments that are still being had in 2026. That is not a show that failed. That is a show that succeeded at something real, something lasting, something worth understanding. The question of whether it should have ended sooner, whether the later seasons compromised the legacy, whether the creator should have stayed more involved, or Fox should have let it go at season 7, these are real questions, and they have real answers depending on what you value. They are also questions about the economics of creativity and the costs of institutional success, questions that don't have clean answers. What is clean is this. The early seasons are still there. They are still brilliant. They are still as funny and warm and strange and specific as they were in 1999 and 2000 and 2001 and 2002. Time does not erode good work. It just accumulates around it. And the early Family Guy is, for people who encounter it with fresh eyes, one of the great discoveries available in the archive of American television comedy. The Griffins are still on Spooner Street. Stewie will have his own show in 2027. The archive runs to over 25 seasons and 450-plus episodes. The theories are still being debated. The clips are still being shared. The catchphrases are still being quoted. And somewhere right now, someone is watching Road to Rhode Island for the first time and being surprised by how good it is. That is the legacy. That is what remains. And it is enough. End of supplementary expansion. Content combined with primary script, total estimated word count. 30,000 plus, expanded section 4. Additional. Peter Griffin's complete transformation. The transformation of Peter Griffin over the show's run is the story that holds everything else together, because Peter is the axis around which all other character changes rotate. Understanding how he changed, why he changed, and what was lost and found in the process is essential to understanding Family Guy as a whole. When Peter Griffin first appeared on screen in January 1999, he was immediately recognizable as a type. The blue-collar American man, physically large, intellectually modest, prone to impulse, deeply attached to his appetites. He liked beer. He liked television. He liked his friends at the bar. He didn't always understand what was happening in the world around him, and his attempts to navigate situations that required more sophistication than he possessed often resulted in chaos that fell on the people nearest to him. But the Peter of the first 3 seasons had something that made him fundamentally sympathetic, despite all of this. A conscience. Not an articulate one. Not one that expressed itself in careful language or deliberate moral reasoning. But an instinctive, genuine sense that when he had hurt someone, he had done something wrong, and he wanted to make it right. He would blunder, he would make things worse, he would fix the wrong thing, or apologize in the wrong way, but the impulse was always there. And because the impulse was always there, you stayed with him. You wanted things to go right for him, even as you watched him make them go wrong. The Flanderization of Peter Griffin, the gradual reduction of a complex character to an exaggerated collection of his most prominent traits, is one of the most documented examples of character degradation in the history of American animation. It happened gradually and then suddenly, the way most things degrade. By season 5, there were already signs. Moments where Peter's stupidity crossed from endearing to alarming, where his behavior toward his children felt genuinely cruel rather than accidentally hurtful. By season 7, the process was well advanced, and by seasons 10 and 11, Peter had become, in many episodes, a fundamentally different character than the one introduced in the pilot. The word most often used to describe late-era Peter is mean, not in the sense of fierce or determined, in the sense of deliberately unkind. There is a version of Peter Griffin who would say something thoughtless to Meg, and then, when confronted with her pain, would feel something and try to address it. And then there is a different version of Peter Griffin, the one who became dominant in the middle seasons, who would say something thoughtless to Meg, and, when she responded in pain, would escalate, who found her pain amusing rather than distressing, who was participating in the abuse rather than causing it accidentally. This is not a small distinction. The difference between a character who causes harm through stupidity and one who causes harm through malice is the difference between a comedy and something darker. When Peter was stupid and well-meaning, the comedy was about the gap between his intentions and his outcomes. When Peter became actively cruel, the comedy attempted to be about the cruelty itself, and comedy about cruelty requires a certain kind of sophisticated framing to work, a framing that the show, in its middle seasons, frequently failed to provide. There is also the physical transformation to note. In the earliest seasons, Peter's violence was occasional and consequence-bearing. When he got hurt, he felt it. When he fell, it mattered. There was a humanity to his physical reality that made him feel real enough for the emotional stakes to register. Over time, particularly after season 5, the physical comedy escalated to a kind of slapstick abandon that drained the character of physical consequence entirely. Peter could survive anything. He could be crushed, burned, thrown from great heights, and return in the next scene completely unaffected. This is true of cartoon physics generally, but the specific loss in Peter's case was that it removed the last physical register of consequence in a character from whom emotional consequence had already been stripped. The road back has been gradual and is still ongoing. There were individual episodes in every season, even the worst ones, where something of the original Peter was briefly recovered, moments of genuine vulnerability, moments where he cared about something real. The chicken fights, paradoxically, are one of the places where this happened most reliably. The violence of those scenes was so absurd and so sustained that it functioned almost as a release valve, letting some of the accumulated pressure of the character's degradation out in an extended physical comedy sequence that the audience enjoyed without having to confront the implications of what Peter had become in more grounded scenes. In the most recent seasons, there are genuine signs of recovery. Writers have been making deliberate efforts to restore something of Peter's original quality, to give him moments of warmth, to let him love his family in visible ways, to make him the author of goodwill rather than just chaos. The process is slow and the results are uneven, but the direction is correct. And that matters because Peter Griffin at his best is one of the great comedy characters, and the people still making the show know it. Expanded Section 6. Additional. Stewie's complete evolution and what was lost. No character in Family Guy's history represents a more philosophically interesting creative problem than Stewie Griffin. He is both the most original character the show ever created and the character whose transformation is most difficult to evaluate in simple terms of gain and loss. The original Stewie, Season 1, early Season 2 Stewie, is a creature of pure theatrical malevolence. He sits in a high chair and speaks with the authority of a man who has been educating himself for decades. He quotes Noel Coward and references geopolitical theory and then turns around and fires a miniature death ray at Lois while she is washing dishes. He does not play with other children, he merely surveys them as potential assets or obstacles. His relationship with Brian in these early episodes is cordial but slightly contemptuous. Brian is smarter than the rest of the household, but Stewie is aware of exactly how far ahead of Brian he actually is. What made this Stewie extraordinary was that his evil was sincere. He was not performing malevolence, he was not being edgy. He wanted to rule the world, and he had constructed practical steps toward doing so. And the comedy came from the gap between the enormity of this ambition and the physical reality of his situation. He was a baby in a diaper, dependent on adults who could not hear him, trapped in a house in a suburban neighborhood without even the physical height to open a door unassisted. The Stewie transformation began with a simple creative problem. The more episodes you make with a character whose primary characteristic is evil, the more you have to escalate or find variety or risk repetition. The show chose variety, and the variety it found in Stewie was his friendship with Brian. Brian was the only character in the household who could engage with Stewie at anything like his level, who could hold a real conversation, follow a real argument, appreciate a real joke. In the early seasons, the Brian-Stewie dynamic was one-sided. Stewie tolerated Brian the way a chess grandmaster might enjoy the company of a capable amateur. Brian was useful and interesting, not an equal. But as the writers developed the friendship, something happened to the balance. Stewie began to need Brian, not in the way that young children need adults, in the way that anyone needs a genuine friend. His self-sufficiency, his contemptuous independence, his certainty that he was superior to everyone in his orbit. These things began to crack when Brian was in danger or unhappy or absent. The episode Life of Brian broke the show open in this respect. Stewie's grief at Brian's death was not played for comedy in the way that his earlier emotions had been. It was played straight. It was allowed to be real. And its realness revealed something that had been building for many seasons. Stewie had been changed by his friendship with Brian, and the change was irreversible. The completed Stewie, the Stewie of seasons 12 onward, is a much more sympathetic character than the original. He experiences genuine emotion. He has real fears and real attachments. He can be hurt in ways the season 1 Stewie could not be hurt because the season 1 Stewie had nothing that could be taken away. The later Stewie has Brian. He has the specific warmth of their odd, mismatched friendship. He has something to lose. What was lost in this evolution is the menace. Not just the theatrical menace of the world domination speeches, the actual threat. The Stewie who built working death rays has been replaced by a Stewie who waves them around for comedy without ever using them. The danger has been replaced by the impression of danger. And while the warmer, more complex Stewie is in many ways a more interesting character, there is something that the show lost when it stopped taking his evil seriously. Something about the specific comedy of a genuinely dangerous baby in a suburban household that cannot entirely be recovered by making him emotionally richer. The spin-off represents an attempt to find a new context for Stewie that works with who he has become rather than mourning who he was. Taking him out of the Griffin household, giving him peers his own size if not his own intelligence, placing him in a school setting where his particular combination of genius and loneliness has room to express itself in new ways, this is the right creative instinct. Stewie in the Griffin household in the later seasons has run out of space. He needs a larger field. Whether the spin-off will succeed depends partly on whether the writers can resist the temptation to make Stewie a purely comedic figure and instead continue the work of the show's later seasons. Treating his inner life as real, his loneliness as genuine, his need for connection as something that deserves to be taken seriously. The character is more interesting as a complex person than as a joke machine, even if he was, in the beginning, one of the best joke machines in the history of animated television. Expanded Section 7. Additional. Meg Griffin, the most honest character on the show. There is an argument to be made, and it is not a frivolous one, that Meg Griffin is the most honest character in Family Guy. Not the most likable, not the best developed, but the most honest, in the sense that her experience of the Griffin household reflects what that household would actually feel like from the inside, if the inside were a real place where real psychology applied. Meg is the child who does not get the benefit of the doubt. She is the child whose emotions are not taken seriously, whose pain is greeted with deflection or ridicule, whose desire for connection is treated as a burden by the very people who should be responding to it with warmth. In a realistic reading of the Griffin family, this is not played for comedy. It is the structure of a genuinely difficult childhood, and the ways Meg responds to it by seeking external validation too desperately, by forming attachments that are easily exploited, by sometimes turning inward and sometimes striking outward, are the ways actual people respond to actual experience of this kind. The show did not always treat Meg with the contempt it became famous for. In the first 3 seasons, Meg's storylines were about adolescent experience, dating, popularity, identity, the desire to be seen for who she actually is rather than who people assume she is. These episodes were often surprisingly tender. Meg in the early seasons was allowed to be the person she was trying to become, and the audience was allowed to root for her. The episode Let's Go to the Hop, in which Meg pretends to be a different kind of person to gain popularity and then has to choose between that persona and her real self, is genuinely well-written and emotionally resonant. The transformation of Meg into the target of sustained family cruelty happened in tandem with the broader Flanderization of the other characters. As Peter became crueler and the show's emotional temperature dropped, Meg became the designated receptacle for that cruelty. But this created a specific problem that the simpler Flanderization of other characters did not. Peter's Flanderization made him less interesting. Meg's Flanderization made her more sympathetic, because cruelty that is so systematic and so persistent starts to accrue its own emotional weight, and Meg's experience of it became increasingly difficult to read as pure comedy. There is a famous episode, Seahorse Seashell Party, in Season 10, in which Meg finally confronts her family about the way she has been treated. She enumerates their failings. She is specific. She is angry. And she is right about everything she says. The family has no defense. And then, at the end of the episode, she takes it all back. She tells her family that she functions as the punching bag that keeps them from turning on each other, that without her as a shared target, they would destroy each other. And so she accepts her role as the family's designated victim for the good of everyone else. She walks back into her position in the family structure, having briefly stepped outside it and seen it clearly and chosen to return. This ending divided audiences and critics. Some found it an unforgivable cop-out, the show acknowledging Meg's real grievance and then refusing to let her act on it. Others found it genuinely complex, an acknowledgement of the ways that family members sometimes sacrifice themselves to maintain the equilibrium of the household, and of the strange, painful loyalty that keeps people in systems that hurt them. Both readings are available in the text of the episode, and the fact that both are available makes it more interesting than either interpretation alone would suggest. The later improvement in Meg's treatment, the gradual shift around seasons 14 and 15, away from the systematic abuse towards something closer to the early seasons version of her, happened not because the show had a sudden change of heart, but because the people in the writer's room who found the abuse unfunny and counterproductive had enough collective influence to push back. The change was real, and it was the result of human effort within the institution of the show. It did not erase what came before. But it allowed Meg to become again something closer to who she was in the first 3 seasons. A person trying to navigate a difficult world with more dignity than the people around her often allowed her. Expanded Section 11. Additional, the music, the performances, and what MacFarlane actually built. There is a dimension of Seth MacFarlane's creative work that often goes undiscussed in conversations about Family Guy's legacy, partly because it exists outside the show itself, his music. MacFarlane is a classically trained singer who has released multiple studio albums of traditional American pop standards, the kind of material associated with Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Tony Bennett. He has performed with live orchestras in major venues. He has sung at the Oscars. He has made his passion for the Great American Songbook a significant part of his public identity. This might seem like a digression from the story of Family Guy. It isn't. Because MacFarlane's musical sensibility is embedded in the show in ways both obvious and subtle. The obvious ways, the show has always been unusually musical, with original songs appearing in almost every episode, many of them in the style of classic Broadway and traditional pop, performed with genuine skill. MacFarlane, voicing Peter or Stewie or Brian, can actually sing. Not animated characters singing, where the performance is part of the joke. Actually singing with real technical proficiency. The musical numbers in Family Guy, particularly in the early seasons, had a quality that was distinct from anything else in American animated television. They were funny because the context was absurd, but the musical execution was genuine, and that combination created something that pure comedy couldn't achieve. The subtle way MacFarlane's musical sensibility is in the show's sense of timing is musical. The rhythm of a well-constructed Family Guy joke, the setup, the beat, the punchline, the pause before the reaction, is the rhythm of live performance comedy, of stand-up and vaudeville, and the kind of timing that you develop by performing in front of audiences rather than just writing for the page. MacFarlane is a performer as well as a writer, and his performance instincts shape the writing at every level. When something is funny in Family Guy at its best, it is often funny because of when it happens as much as because of what it is. Voicing 4 main characters, Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, plus various recurring figures and guest characters, McFarlane has spent more than 25 years in a recording booth bringing this world to life. Each of the four main voices is distinct enough to be immediately identifiable, a technical achievement that is easy to underestimate because it is so familiar. Peter's voice has a specific Massachusetts working-class quality, softened slightly from reality into something more cartoon accessible. Brian's voice is McFarlane's own, clearest and most unaltered. Stewie's Rex Harrison-derived accent, maintained with remarkable consistency across hundreds of episodes and thousands of lines. Quagmire's rapid-fire period delivery, a specific period pastiche, held in place through sheer consistency of performance. What four voices means in practical terms. McFarlane sits down to record an episode and, in the same session, voices conversations that he is having with himself. Peter arguing with Brian, Stewie plotting with Quagmire, Brian and Stewie in the bank vault having their most honest conversation of the series. All of these are at the physical level of performance, one man in a recording booth, switching between personas, finding the right quality for each voice, making each one distinct enough that the audience doesn't lose track of who is speaking. This is a technical challenge that most voice actors never face at this scale, and McFarlane's ability to execute it across 25 years of production is one of the less celebrated aspects of what makes Family Guy work as a piece of performance art. The show's use of celebrity guest voices is also worth examining at length. Family Guy developed, particularly in its revival seasons, a culture of celebrity cameos that became almost self-parodying in its excess. The formula was familiar. A famous person would appear as themselves, the character would react to their presence in some comedic way, and the joke would be about the gap between the celebrity's public image and some aspect of their actual behavior or career. Some of these were genuinely sharp, moments where the celebrity was willing to be the object of genuine satire rather than gentle teasing. Others were simply transactional, appearances that served marketing purposes more than creative ones. The most interesting celebrity appearances in Family Guy history are the ones where the celebrity stayed for more than one episode, where they were developed as recurring characters rather than one-off punchlines. James Woods, as mentioned earlier, Adam West, who appeared so frequently and with such commitment that his death in 2017 left a genuine void in the show's recurring cast. The episodes produced in the years after West's death that acknowledged his absence were among the most sincere the show had been in years, a genuine goodbye to a man who had been part of the show's world for its entire history. The creative partnership between McFarlane and Alex Borstein, Lois, Seth Green, Chris, Mila Kunis, Meg, and Mike Henry, Cleveland, Ahmad. Though Henry stepped away from the role in 2020 and was replaced by Arif Zahar, has produced something unusual in American television. A voice cast that has, with some changes, held together through more than 25 years of production. The chemistry of the early seasons was partly the result of those specific people having developed a working shorthand, an understanding of how each character's voice related to the others. When the cast is at its best, the recordings feel like actual conversations between people who genuinely know each other. That is not an accident. That is the product of decades of working together, and it is one of the things about Family Guy that no subsequent animated series can simply replicate by hiring good voice actors. Closing supplement. Letters to the characters. There is one final thing worth doing as we close out this long and winding story. Let us speak directly to the characters. Not as an analyst or a theorist, just as someone who has watched them for a long time and thought about them more than is probably reasonable, and who has something to say that the usual format of television criticism doesn't quite make room for. Peter, the best version of you, the version that existed in those first 3 seasons and that still appears occasionally in flashes in the later ones, is someone worth admiring. Not for your intelligence or your judgment, neither of which is impressive by any measure, but for something simpler and harder to find, the fact that, at your best, you love your family and you know it and you don't pretend otherwise. The chaos you cause is real and the damage is real and the people around you bear the weight of it in ways you don't always see. But underneath all of it, beneath the impulsiveness and the volume and the disasters you walk into and create, there is a person who genuinely didn't want to harm anyone, who wanted to be good and just didn't quite know how. That person is still there even in the years when the show forgot about him. He's the reason the rest of it was worth watching. Brian, The most honest thing that can be said about you is that you were, for a few remarkable seasons, the best argument Family Guy ever made for taking its own characters seriously. You were drawn with the kind of complexity that makes someone feel real. Real enough to disappoint, real enough to surprise, real enough that when you died, for however brief a moment, it felt like an actual loss. The show has not always been kind to you. It has reduced you periodically to the sum of your flaws, the pretension, the hypocrisy, the drinking, the failed writing. But the relationship between you and Stewie, the specific texture of how two people who should have nothing in common find in each other the one thing they were missing, is the show's most lasting achievement. Whatever else happens, that is real. Stewie. In the beginning, you were going to rule the world, and that ambition was wonderful and terrifying and absolutely central to why anyone fell in love with this show. You have since found something you didn't expect. That world domination is much less interesting than being genuinely known by someone. The trade is a good one, even if you would never admit it. The spin-off that is coming is for you, which means it is also for the audience that watched you grow from a miniaturized villain into something more complicated and more human. That is an extraordinary arc, more than most real people manage. Meg. There is a version of this show in which you were the lead character, the one whose growth and resilience and hard-won sense of self anchored everything else. That show was never made, and the show that was made instead was not always kind to you. But the Meg of the early seasons is still in the archive, still recognizable, still the person you would have been if the story had chosen her more carefully. She matters. You matter. The later episodes that remembered this were telling the truth. Lois. You have been underwritten for most of this show's run, and the character who deserved the most complexity, the woman who chose a different life and built something real from that choice, has too often been reduced to the woman who holds everything together and asks nothing for herself. The early seasons saw you more clearly. They are worth returning to for that alone. And to Seth MacFarlane, you were 24 years old in 1998, pitching 7 minutes of animation to executives at a television network. And what you were pitching was something that you had been building since you were 2 years old, drawing cartoons on whatever you could find. The path from that 2-year-old in Connecticut to the show that has now existed for more than a quarter century is not a straight one. It winds through Hanna-Barbera writing rooms and Rhode Island art school thesis projects, and a missed flight, and a canceled show, and an improbable revival, and 25 years of production and 3 billion streaming minutes, and a spin-off still to come. What you built, at its best, is genuinely worth all of the examination this long night has given it. The town on Spooner Street, with its improbable family and their impossible neighbor, and the bar where they still gather at the end of a long day, it was real enough to matter. That is the rarest thing. Sleep now. The story will still be there in the morning. Expanded Section 9. Additional, the giant chicken, the recurring myths, and the show's internal folklore. Every long-running show develops its own folklore. Running gags, recurring characters, structural devices that appear so frequently they become part of the show's identity rather than just its content. Family Guy has more of these than almost any show in television history, and some of them deserve the kind of attention that casual viewing doesn't always give them. Ernie the Giant Chicken. Let's spend some real time on this because it is worth it. Ernie, B. Voiced by Danny Smith, one of the show's long-tenured writers, first appeared in the Season 2 episode Da Boom, which aired in 1999. The origin of their feud is almost comically mundane. Ernie gave Peter a coupon that had expired, and Peter refused to accept it. This minor social friction escalated, in the way that things escalate in the show, into physical combat of apocalyptic proportions. The fight in Da Boom introduced the template that every subsequent chicken fight would follow, a completely unexpected encounter, followed by violence that extends far beyond any reasonable proportions, playing out across multiple locations and settings before concluding, with one of them apparently dead, only for the other to walk away, and the cycle to be ready to begin again. There have been major chicken fight sequences in Seasons 2, 4, 8, and 12, among others. Each one is more elaborate than the last. Each one takes a small slight or misunderstanding as its origin and extrapolates from it to a level of destruction that would constitute a mass casualty event in a realistic world. Cars are destroyed. Buildings are damaged. At one point, Peter and Ernie fight through a moving subway train. At another, they battle through a space station. The camera follows them with the breathless commitment of a documentary crew trying to keep up with an unfolding historical event. The comedy of the giant chicken fights operates on a very specific principle: escalation without consequence. The fights are so enormous, so sustained, so destructive, that they have clearly gone beyond anything that personal animosity could justify. But they continue because neither Peter nor Ernie has a mechanism for stopping them. The fights have taken on a momentum of their own. They are no longer about the coupon, they are about themselves. About the fact that this is what happens when Peter sees Ernie, and there is no available narrative that allows for any other outcome. There is an episode, The Splendid Source, in Season 8, in which Peter and his friends go on an adventure that leads them, eventually, to a moment of genuine emotional exchange with Ernie. The two of them sit together, they talk. They acknowledge, with a kind of surprised honesty, that they don't actually dislike each other. The violence between them has been almost automatic, a habit rather than a genuine hostility. And then something happens to reset the dynamic, and the next fight begins. This cycle, peace glimpsed, then violence returning, then peace glimpsed again, is one of the show's most persistently interesting philosophical puzzles. Is Peter fundamentally incapable of resolving the chicken situation? Or is the resolution always available and always foregone by choice? There is a version of the chicken fights that reads as a comedy about the way humans perpetuate conflicts that have long outlasted their original causes. The way old grudges and old patterns of escalation become self-sustaining, because neither party knows how to step out of the pattern even when they briefly see it clearly. Ernie has, over the seasons, been given a wife and a family of his own. This humanizing detail, showing that this enormous chicken who periodically engages in existential combat with Peter Griffin goes home to a domestic life not unlike Peter's own, is one of the weirder and more interesting things the show has done with a recurring character. It suggests that the fights are not the whole of Ernie's existence. He is, outside of his encounters with Peter, a relatively ordinary citizen of this fictional New England town. He has responsibilities and relationships. He is not defined by the violence. And somehow this makes the violence funnier rather than less funny, because it normalizes Ernie in a way that makes the abnormality of what happens between them more visible. The Death Grim Reaper as a recurring character is another example of the show's folklore. Death, voiced originally by Norm Macdonald and later by Adam Carolla, became a recurring presence in the show after the Season 1 episode Death is a Bitch, in which Peter fakes his own death to avoid paying a hospital bill, and the actual Grim Reaper falls and breaks his ankle at their house, requiring the Griffins to host him while he recovers. The episode established Death as a character with his own personality, awkward, somewhat passive, prone to the same kinds of ordinary social discomfort as anyone else, and his subsequent appearances built on this foundation. Death is a regular person who has a difficult job. The show's treatment of him as simultaneously a figure of ultimate consequence and a figure of mundane limitation is one of the better running gags in its history. Francis Griffin, Peter's father, a strict, often harsh man whose Catholic conservatism generated constant friction with his son, is one of the show's more interesting recurring figures in the early seasons. He appeared in multiple episodes, and his relationship with Peter had genuine texture. A history of strictness that Peter resented, but that had also clearly shaped who Peter became, in ways that Peter could not always articulate. Francis died in Season 6 in the episode Peter's Two Dads, which also introduced the possibility, subsequently developed into its own storyline, that Peter's biological father was someone other than Francis. The resolution of the biological father question, which identified a man named Mickey McFinnigan as Peter's genetic father, allowed the show to develop Peter's Irish heritage in ways that the Francis storyline had left underdeveloped. But the loss of Francis as a recurring presence was a real one. He was one of the few characters in the show whose relationship with Peter had the specific weight of generational history. Diane Simmons, the local news anchor, deserves recognition as one of the show's more surprising late reveal characters. For most of the show's early history, she was simply part of the Channel 5 news framing device, a vehicle for exposition, a recurring face that grounded the show's relationship with local community news. Then, in the season 9 episode And Then There Were Fewer, Diane was revealed as a murderer. She killed multiple people during a dinner party in an Agatha Christie-style mystery episode before being shot by Stewie. Her death was permanent, and the episode's tonal commitment to actually taking the violence seriously made it one of the more genuinely surprising pieces of television the show produced in its middle years. The Mayor Adam West character deserves a final word. Adam West, the real Adam West, the actor, appeared in Family Guy so many times and with such consistent delight in the material that his version of the mayor became one of the show's defining recurring characters. He was not playing the serious version of Batman. He was playing a version of himself in which all the eccentricities and non sequiturs of a public figure who had lived a strange life in the public eye had been amplified to the point of gentle absurdism. He accepted citations at ceremonies for things he hadn't done. He responded to civic challenges with pronouncements that were both completely unhelpful and strangely poetic. He was, in his way, a figure of unconscious grace, a man who had found, in his later years, a comedy context that suited him perfectly and threw himself into it without reservation. When Adam West died in June of 2017, Seth MacFarlane posted a tribute that was among the most genuine things he ever wrote publicly about anyone connected to the show. The loss was real. The character has not been officially recast, and the episodes that have referenced Mayor West's absence have treated the loss with the kind of understated sincerity that is, in the context of Family Guy, an unusual and moving choice. A note on watching Family Guy. Now in 2026, if you were to sit down right now and begin watching Family Guy from the beginning, from Death Has a Shadow, the very first episode, broadcast after Super Bowl 33 in January 1999, you would be watching something that is nearly 30 years old. The animation has the texture of late 90s television production. Some of the references land immediately and some require context that the culture no longer provides automatically. The characters move slightly differently than they do in the modern episodes. The pace is different. The rhythm of the jokes is different. And yet it works. It works in a way that is not simply nostalgic, not simply the warm familiarity of returning to something you once loved. It works because the fundamentals, the characters, the relationships, the comedic timing, the genuine warmth underneath the absurdism, are as good as they were when they were new. Good writing does not expire. Good character work does not become less good because the world has moved on. The Griffins of the early seasons are as compelling now as they were in 1999, and the proof is in the 3 billion streaming minutes they accumulated in 2025 alone. The middle seasons, the long difficult period from roughly season 5 through season 12, are more complicated to return to. They contain some of the show's most technically accomplished work alongside some of its most troubling. The Megabuse years are genuinely uncomfortable to watch now with clear eyes, in a way that they perhaps weren't entirely when they aired. Peter's cruelty in those years reads differently after 2 decades of reflection on what the show was doing and why. These are not seasons to abandon. They contain important chapters in the show's history and some individually great episodes. But they are seasons to watch with an understanding of their context rather than an uncritical affection. The later seasons, from 13 onward, show a show that is aware of its own history and is trying, imperfectly but genuinely, to do better. The Meg treatment improves. Peter recovers some of his original warmth. The writing staff has turned over enough times that people who grew up watching Family Guy are now the ones making it, and they bring with them both the love of what the show was and the critical awareness of what it sometimes became. These seasons are uneven. They contain episodes that feel like they could have been made by the original writing staff, and episodes that feel like they were assembled from a checklist of what Family Guy episodes are supposed to contain. But the direction is the right one, and the best of them are genuinely good. If you are new to Family Guy, if you have never watched it, and this long night of storytelling has made you curious, start at the beginning. Watch the first 3 seasons with your full attention. Let yourself fall for the characters as they were originally conceived. Then, when you reach season 4 and notice that something has shifted, you will understand what shifted and why it matters. And then you will have the full picture, which is more interesting than any partial version of it. If you are returning to Family Guy, If you loved it once and drifted away and are wondering whether it's worth coming back, the answer depends on what you loved. If you loved the characters, they are still there, in better shape than they were for a decade. If you loved the specific humor of the early years, the revival seasons are different, but the best of them are still funny. If you loved the theories, the purgatory, the multiverse, the secret histories of these people, they have only accumulated more material over the years. There is more to think about now than there ever was. And if you loved it the way you loved something that made you feel seen at a particular moment in your life, the way early Family Guy made a lot of people feel seen, as someone for whom laughter was a way of processing the weight of being alive, then it is still that. In the right episode, at the right moment, it is still that. The show is still running. The Griffins are still on Spooner Street. The light is on in Stewie's room. Brian is still at the kitchen counter working on something, or at least telling himself he's about to. Peter is watching television, loud and alive, improbably and permanently himself. It goes on, as things that matter tend to do.